The wind came down from the high peaks of the Mogollon Rim with a bite that felt like a whip of invisible wire. It hissed through the dry, skeletal branches of the sagebrush and kicked up little devils of dust and ice crystals that danced across the hard-packed earth. Luke Carver pulled the collar of his sheepskin coat higher, tucking his chin against his chest, but the wool was worn thin in places, and the cold found every way in. He had been riding since first light, and the sun was already bleeding out into a bruised purple smear along the western horizon. He was a man who looked like the country itself, hard, weathered, and eroded by too many seasons of bad luck and worse choices. His hat was stained with sweat and rain. The brim pulled low over eyes that were the color of flint and just as hard. At 35 years of age, he felt twice that. His knuckles were raw and red where they gripped the reins, and his bay gelding, a sturdy animal named Roan, walked with its head down, tired and eager for a windbreak that did not seem to exist in this God-forsaken stretch of the territory. Luke reached into his saddlebag, his fingers brushing the last of his hardtack and a strip of jerky that was tough enough to shoe a mule. He was low on supplies. He had $3 in his pocket and a reputation that followed him like a stray dog he could not kick loose. He had spent the last 2 years drifting between cattle outfits, branding mavericks and riding fence lines, but he never stayed long. Sooner or later, someone would talk. Someone would mention the scouting days. Someone would ask if it was true that he had ridden with Crook or Mackenzie, and if he had been there when the villages burned. The memory hit him then, unbidden and sharp as a knife thrust. He saw the smoke rising in thick, oily columns against a blue sky. He heard the screaming. It was not the screaming of warriors dying in battle, which a man could stomach, but the high, terrified wails of women and children running through the burning lodges while the soldiers fired with mechanical precision. He had been a scout then, paid $20 a month to find the trails, and he had told himself it was just a job. He had told himself he was keeping the peace. But the ghosts of those burning camps rode behind him now, darker than his shadow. He shook his head, physically trying to rattle the thought loose. He needed to focus on the trail. He was heading toward the mining camps near Silver City, hoping for work that did not require a man to have a clean conscience, just a strong back. The trail narrowed as it wound up into the foothills, the scrub brush giving way to ponderosa pines that cast long, blue shadows across the snow-dusted ground. The silence here was heavy, broken only by the crunch of hooves on frozen needles and the wind sighing in the upper branches. Suddenly, Roan threw his head up and shied violently to the left, nearly unseating Luke. Luke tightened his grip on the reins and spoke low and rough. "Easy," he said. "Easy now." The horse danced sideways, ears pinned flat against his skull, nostrils flaring. Luke reached down and slid his Winchester from the scabbard, his thumb resting instinctively on the hammer. He scanned the tree line, his heart kicking a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. It might be a mountain lion, or perhaps a bear roused from its den. But then he heard it. It was a sound that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It was a guttural, agonized snarl. Human but stripped of all reason by pain, followed by the distinct, metallic clank of heavy chain hitting stone. Luke held the rifle steady. His instinct, honed by years of surviving in a land that wanted him dead, screamed at him to turn Roan around and ride. Whatever was in those trees was trouble. If it was an animal, it was dangerous. If it was a man, it was likely worse. But the sound came again. A low groan that ended in a sharp intake of breath. Curiosity, or perhaps a lingering scrap of decency he thought he had lost years ago, made him nudge the horse forward. He guided Roan off the trail and into the dense shadow of the pines. 50 yards in, the trees opened up into a small clearing where a game trail crossed a dry creek bed. There, thrashing in the dirt, was a nightmare made flesh. A man lay on the ground, his leg clamped tight in the rusted, merciless jaws of a number 5 bear trap. He was massive, his shoulders broad and powerful under a buckskin shirt, his long black hair matted with sweat and pine needles. He was Apache. Luke pulled Roan up short. The warrior stopped thrashing the moment he saw the horseman. He froze, his chest heaving, his face a mask of sweat and dirt, twisted in agony. But his eyes were clear. They were black and burning with a rage so potent it seemed to heat the air between them. The Apache did not beg. He did not cry out for help. Instead, he reached down with a trembling hand to the sheath at his belt and drew a long, heavy knife. He rolled onto his side, putting himself between Luke and the trap, raising the blade in a shaking hand. He looked like a wolf that had been broken but was still ready to tear the throat out of anything that came close. Luke stared at him. The trap was chained to a heavy log, a cruel device set by fur trappers who did not care what they caught. The steel teeth had bitten deep into the warrior's calf. The snow around the leg was stained dark crimson. Luke looked at the knife, then at the man's face. He knew what this man was. This was the enemy. This was the terrifying shadow that haunted the nightmares of every settler and soldier in the territory. If Luke rode away, the cold and the wolves would finish the job before morning. The world would say it was one less savage to worry about. But Luke looked at the leg again. He saw the way the muscle jumped and quivered. He saw the white bone of the ankle exposed where the skin had torn. He felt a sick, heavy feeling in his gut. He had seen enough men die. He had seen enough bodies left to rot. He swore softly under his breath. "Don't you do anything stupid," Luke said aloud, his voice sounding flat in the cold air. The warrior snarled something in his own tongue, a harsh, guttural warning, and jabbed the knife at the air. Luke holstered the rifle but kept his hand near his revolver. He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground, his boots crunching in the snow. The Apache flinched, his eyes darting to Luke's gun hand, then back to his face. "I am not going to shoot you," Luke said, holding his hands out where the man could see them. "Unless you make me." He walked slowly toward the trapped man. The warrior dragged himself backward, the heavy log groaning as it plowed through the dirt. The trap clanked, and a fresh wave of blood soaked the buckskin legging. The warrior hissed through his teeth, his face going gray with shock. But he did not drop the knife. Luke stopped 10 feet away. He unslung his canteen and shook it. The sound of water sloshing inside made the warrior's eyes flicker. "Thirsty?" Luke asked. The man stared at him, suspicion warring with desperate need. Luke took a drink himself, wiping his mouth with his sleeve, then took a step closer and tossed the canteen. It landed in the dirt near the warrior's hand. The Apache watched him for a long moment, then snatched up the canteen. He struggled with the cap, his hands shaking, before tipping it back and draining half of it in greedy gulps. When he lowered it, the knife came right back up. Luke sighed. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the piece of jerky. He tore off a chunk and ate it, showing the man it was safe, then tossed the rest. The warrior ignored the meat. He was watching Luke's hands. "I can get that iron off your leg," Luke said, pointing to the trap. "But you have to put the knife down." The warrior did not understand the words, but he understood the gesture. He looked at the trap, then at Luke. He shook his head violently. Luke took a step forward. The warrior lunged, slashing the air inches from Luke's knee. Luke jumped back, his hand hovering over his colt. "Look," Luke said, his voice rising in frustration. "You stay in that. You die, freezing or bleeding. Take your pick. I am trying to help you." He looked around the clearing. The sun was gone now, dropped behind the peaks. The temperature was plummeting. If he was going to do this, it had to be now. He took off his heavy coat and tossed it onto the ground near the warrior. Then he unbuckled his gun belt. The warrior watched, confused, as Luke hung the holstered revolver on a low branch of a pine tree, well out of reach. "I am unarmed," Luke said. "You see?" He walked forward again. This time, the warrior did not slash. He watched Luke with the intensity of a hawk. His muscles coiled, but he allowed Luke to come within reach. Luke knelt in the snow. The smell of the man was strong. Sweat, wood smoke, and the copper tang of blood. Luke looked at the trap. It was a double-spring model, old and rusted. To open it, he would need leverage. The springs were incredibly stiff. He looked at the warrior, meeting his gaze. The eyes were dark and deep, full of intelligence and pain. "I am going to hurt you," Luke said quietly. No way around it. He moved to the trap. The warrior tensed, the knife hovering near Luke's throat. Luke ignored it. He placed his boots on the heavy steel springs on either side of the jaws. He grabbed the upper jaws with his gloved hands. "Ready?" Luke grunted. He put his entire weight onto the springs. They groaned, rust grinding against rust. The jaws barely moved. Luke gritted his teeth, sweat popping out on his forehead despite the cold. He pressed down with everything he had, straining until the veins in his neck stood out like cords. The springs gave, slowly, agonizingly. The jaws began to widen. The warrior let out a low, keening sound as the teeth pulled back from his torn flesh. The blood began to flow faster. "Pull your leg out," Luke shouted, gasping for breath. The warrior understood. He dragged his leg free, leaving a ruin of shredded leather and flesh behind. Luke held the trap open for another second, then stepped off the springs. The jaws slammed shut with a crack that sounded like a gunshot, snapping a dry stick that had fallen across the pan. Luke collapsed back into the snow, breathing hard. The warrior had dropped the knife. He was clutching his leg, his head thrown back, his chest heaving. Luke didn't give him time to go into shock. He scrambled up and went to Roan, grabbing his saddle blanket and a spare shirt from his bags. He ripped the shirt into strips. He found 2 straight, sturdy branches on the ground and snapped them to length. He knelt beside the warrior again. The bleeding was bad. "Hold still," Luke commanded. He worked quickly, packing the wound with the cleanest cloth he had, binding it tight to stop the flow. The warrior watched him, his face pale, sweat freezing on his brow. He did not make a sound as Luke set the splint and tied it off with strips of the saddle blanket. When it was done, Luke sat back on his heels. His hands were covered in the man's blood. He wiped them on the snow. "You are a lucky son of a bitch," Luke said. The warrior looked at his leg, then at Luke. He reached out and touched Luke's arm. It was a brief, hesitant contact. He spoke a single word in Apache, his voice raspy. Luke didn't know the word, but the tone was enough. He stood up and looked at the sky. It was turning a deep, indigo blue. The first stars were appearing. "We can't stay here," Luke said. "You'll freeze before midnight." He looked at the warrior's size. The man was nearly 6.5 feet tall and built like a darker version of the mountains themselves. Luke looked at Roan. The horse was strong, but this was going to be a load. "Up," Luke said, panting as he bent down and hooked his arm under the warrior's shoulder. It took 5 minutes of struggling, cursing, and slipping in the snow to get the man into the saddle. The warrior nearly passed out twice, his face going slack, but he held on to the pommel with a grip of iron. Luke took the reins. He looked at the trail ahead. Earlier in the afternoon, he had seen a thin wisp of smoke rising from a canyon to the east, maybe 4 miles away. It could be prospectors. It could be outlaws. But given the feathers tied into this man's hair and the moccasins on his feet, it was likely his people. Luke knew that walking into an Apache camp was a good way to get killed. He knew it with every instinct he possessed. But he looked at the man slumping in his saddle, blood dripping slowly onto the snow. He couldn't just dump him under a tree. Hell of a way to die. "Carver," he muttered to himself. He started walking, leading the horse through the darkening woods. The journey was a blur of exhaustion. The wind picked up, driving icy needles into Luke's exposed face. He had given his coat to the warrior, wrapping it around the man's shoulders. Luke walked in his vest and flannel shirt, his body numb, his feet stumbling on roots and rocks he couldn't see. Every shadow looked like an ambush. Every snap of a twig sounded like a bowstring. Luke kept his eyes moving, his hand resting on the neck of his horse for warmth. It was fully night when they smelled the smoke. It was wood smoke, rich and heavy. They came over a low ridge and looked down into a box canyon protected from the wind. Below, glowing like embers in the dark, were the fires of a camp. There were wickiups scattered among the boulders, blending into the land so well that a man might ride past within 50 yards and never see them. Luke hesitated. He could leave the man here. He could fire a shot in the air to attract attention and then run. But the warrior groaned, swaying dangerously in the saddle. He was slipping away. If he fell off now, he wouldn't get up. Luke ground his teeth together and started down the slope. He didn't make it 20 yards before the night came alive. One moment, there was silence. The next, the brush erupted. Men materialized out of the darkness as if they had been woven from the shadows themselves. Luke jerked on the reins, halting the horse. He did not reach for his gun. He knew it was useless. There were a dozen of them. They were lean, hard men with paint on their faces and rifles in their hands. A bowstring creaked as it was drawn taut. Luke raised his hands slowly, showing his empty palms. "Don't shoot!" he called out, his voice cracking. "I have a wounded man." The warriors rushed him. Strong hands grabbed him, dragging him down from the horse's neck where he had been guiding it. He hit the ground hard. The wind knocked out of him. A rifle barrel was jammed into his cheek, pressing his head into the frozen dirt. He heard shouts, the rapid-fire exchange of the Apache tongue. He heard the horse whinny as they pulled the massive warrior from the saddle. He waited for the knife. He waited for the bullet. "Hold!" The voice was not loud, but it cut through the chaos like a blade. It carried the weight of absolute authority. The pressure of the rifle barrel eased slightly. Luke turned his head, spitting dirt. An older man was walking through the circle of warriors. He wore a heavy buffalo robe, and his hair was gray, hanging in 2 long braids wrapped in red cloth. His face was a map of deep lines and scars, but his eyes were sharp, intelligent, and unyielding. This was a man who had seen everything under the sun and feared none of it. This was Nantan. Even Luke, who had only heard the name in whispered rumors around army campfires, recognized the bearing of the chief. Nantan looked at the warrior being supported by 3 men. He saw the splint. He saw the white man's coat draped over his shoulders. He saw the blood. "Taza," the chief said softly. The wounded warrior lifted his head weakly. He spoke a few words, breathless and pained, pointing a trembling hand at Luke. Nantan turned his gaze to Luke. He studied him for a long, uncomfortable minute. He looked at Luke's hands, which were raised and shaking slightly from the cold. He looked at the blood on Luke's shirt, blood that belonged to his son. "Let him up," Nantan ordered in broken English. The warriors stepped back, though their weapons remained leveled at Luke's chest. Luke scrambled to his feet, shivering violently now that the adrenaline was fading and the cold was taking hold. "Why?" Nantan asked. He stepped closer, smelling of sage and old leather. "Why does a white man bring an Apache warrior home? Why is he not scalped and left for the buzzards?" Luke wrapped his arms around himself, trying to stop his teeth from chattering. "Found him," Luke stammered. "Bear trap, up on the ridge. You freed him." Luke nodded. Couldn't leave him. Not like that." Nantan looked at the bandage on Taza's leg. He saw the torn strips of the white man's shirt. He looked back at Luke, his eyes narrowing. He saw the shabbiness of Luke's clothes, the hunger in the hollows of his cheeks, and the strange, haunted look in his eyes. "You are a fool," Nantan said, "or a brave man. It is hard to tell the difference." He gestured to his men. "Bring him to the fire. Take his weapons. If Taza dies, this man dies." Luke was marched into the center of the camp. They took his gun belt, his knife, and even the small pocket knife he kept in his vest. They pushed him down onto a buffalo robe near a large central fire. The heat hit him like a physical blow, painful on his frozen skin. He sat there, rubbing his hands together, watching as the camp reacted to the arrival. Women rushed out of the wickiups. A medicine man began shaking a rattle over Taza, who had been laid out on blankets near the fire. Luke felt eyes on him. He looked up. Standing across the fire was a young woman. She was tall, straight-backed, and wrapped in a blanket woven with geometric patterns of red and black. Her hair was loose, falling around her face like a dark curtain. Her face was striking, high cheekbones, a strong nose, and a mouth set in a grim line. But it was her eyes that pinned Luke to the spot. They were dark, shaped like almonds, and filled with a cold, pure hatred. She looked at him as if he were a disease that had walked into their sanctuary. She moved to Taza's side, pushing the men away, and began to inspect the wound herself. Her hands were gentle with her brother, but when she glanced back at Luke across the flames, her expression did not soften. She said something to Nantan, her voice sharp and accusatory. She pointed at Luke, then mimed a rifle. Luke understood enough. She recognized him, or she recognized his type. The drifter, the scout, the enemy. Nantan ignored her. He was watching the medicine man work. After a long time, the medicine man nodded and spoke to the chief. Taza would live. The leg was bad, but the bone was not shattered, and the bleeding had stopped. Nantan let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for hours. He turned to the fire and stared into the flames. The camp went quiet. The warriors, the women, the children, everyone watched the chief. Luke held his breath. He was alive, for now. He waited for them to tell him to go. He would take his horse and ride until the horse dropped. Nantan turned to Luke. "You gave him water?" Nantan asked. "Yes," Luke said. "You gave him your coat." It was cold. "You carried him?" Luke nodded. Nantan stepped around the fire. He stood over Luke, looking down. "My son is the future of this tribe," Nantan said. "His life is the life of the people. You saved him when his own brother would have left him for fear of the spirits of the dead." Luke didn't know what to say. "I did what I had to." Nantan nodded slowly. "A debt is owed. A debt of life. It cannot be paid with horses. It cannot be paid with silver coins that the white man loves." He paused, looking at his daughter. She was standing up now, wiping blood from her hands. She looked at her father, her brow furrowing in confusion. Nantan raised his voice so the whole camp could hear. "The blood of this white man has mixed with the blood of my son on the bandages. He has bound himself to us, to balance the scales. He must become of us." Luke blinked. "What?" Nantan pointed a gnarled finger at the woman. "You will take my daughter, Ayana, as your wife. You will become my son by law. This is how the debt is paid." The silence that followed was absolute. Then, the camp erupted. Ayana looked as if she had been slapped. She stepped forward, her voice rising in a shriek of disbelief. "Father, no!" She unleashed a torrent of Apache, gesturing wildly at Luke, then at the scars on her own arms. She pointed to the south, where the reservation lay, and spat into the fire. Luke scrambled to his feet. "Now hold on a minute," he said, his voice rising in panic. "I didn't ask for anything. I don't want a reward. I just want my horse and I'll be gone." Nantan turned on him, his face hard as granite. "It is not a reward, white man." Nantan growled. "It is a bond. If you are family, you will not lead the soldiers to us. If you are family, you will fight for us. If you are family, my daughter's life is your life." "But I'm a drifter," Luke argued, backing away until he bumped into a warrior who shoved him back toward the fire. "I ain't husband material for anyone, let alone—" He looked at Ayana. She was shaking with rage. She turned to Luke, her eyes brimming with tears of fury. "I will not lie with a white dog." She hissed in perfect, accented English. "I would rather die." "Then you defy your chief?" Nantan asked softly. Ayana froze. She looked at her father, betrayal written on every line of her face. "You trade me like a horse," she whispered, "just like them. You are no better than the soldiers." Nantan's expression was pained, but he did not waver. "I secure your future. A lone woman has no protection in this world. A woman with a white husband. Perhaps she survives when the end comes." He waved his hand, dismissing the argument. "It is done." Ayana let out a sound of pure frustration. She glared at Luke with such venom that he actually took a step back. "Do not think this makes you safe," she said, her voice trembling. "You sleep with one eye open. Cowboy." She turned and stormed off into the darkness, vanishing into one of the wiki-ups. Luke stood there, stunned. He looked at Nantan. "You can't do this," Luke said. Nantan sat down by the fire and wrapped his robe around him. "Sit," the chief commanded. "Eat. You have a long winter ahead of you, son." Luke looked at the warriors surrounding him. He looked at the vast, empty darkness beyond the firelight. He sank down onto the buffalo robe, the heat of the fire doing nothing to thaw the ice in his stomach. He watched the sparks drift up toward the stars. He had ridden out that morning a free man, a nobody. Now he was a prisoner, a savior, and a husband to a woman who wanted to kill him. He looked toward the tent where Ayanna had disappeared. The flap was closed tight. Luke Carver rested his head in his hands and listened to the wind howling through the canyon, knowing that he had just walked into the biggest trap of all. Dawn broke over the high desert with a silence that felt brittle enough to snap. The light did not arrive all at once, but crept down the faces of the distant ridges, turning the gray stone to a bruised purple and then to a brilliant, glowing pink. In the valley floor where the camp lay hidden, the air was still heavy with the night's freeze. Frost coated the dry yellow grass like a dusting of diamond dust, crunching softly under the paws of camp dogs that trotted between the brush huts with their heads low. Luke Carver woke with a gasp. The cold already settled deep in his bones. He was sitting on the ground with his back against the rough bark of a pinyon pine, his wrists bound loosely with rawhide thongs. He was not tied to the tree, a small mercy that allowed him to shift his position, but a guard sat only 10 feet away, wrapped in a blanket, a rifle resting across his knees. Luke flexed his stiff fingers, watching his breath plume in the icy air. He felt like a man who had walked out of one life and fallen into a dream that might turn into a nightmare at any moment. He was alive. That was the only fact he could hold on to. As the sun crested the peaks, the camp began to stir. It was a transformation that fascinated Luke despite his fear. One moment, the wickiups, low, dome-shaped structures covered in brush and hides, looked like mounds of earth. The next, they were hives of activity. Women emerged, their breath steaming, moving with efficient purpose to stoke the embers of the cooking fires. Thin columns of blue wood smoke rose straight up into the cold sky, blending with the smell of pine resin and sage. He watched children, some no older than 4 or 5, run toward the creek to break the thin ice and fetch water in woven jugs sealed with pitch. They laughed and shoved each other, their voices bright and clear, indifferent to the fact that a white stranger watched them from the edge of their world. Warriors moved among the horses, checking hooves and rubbing down flanks. It was a scene of domestic normalcy that hit Luke with a pang of guilt. He was an intruder here. He was a representative of the very force that threatened to extinguish this morning ritual forever. He saw the way the women glanced at him, not with fear, but with a hardened wariness. To them, he was not a guest. He was a problem that had not yet been solved. The guard grunted and stood, gesturing for Luke to rise. Luke pushed himself up, his knees popping. He was led not to the edge of the camp where he might be executed, but back toward the central fire where Nantan sat on a buffalo robe, drinking something steaming from a clay cup. The chief looked different in the daylight. The firelight had made him look like a spirit. The sun revealed a man of flesh and blood, with deep creases around his eyes and hands that showed the gnarled swelling of age and hard work. "Sit," Nantan said, pointing to a spot on the hard earth across from him. Luke sat. A woman placed a wooden bowl in his hands. It contained a thin corn mush, hot and flavorless, but Luke ate it gratefully. The warmth spread through his chest, loosening the knot of tension just a fraction. "You slept?" Nantan asked. His voice was calm, conversational, as if they were 2 ranchers discussing the price of beef. "Enough," Luke replied, wiping his mouth with his sleeve. Nantan nodded. He looked at the surrounding hills, his eyes scanning the horizon instinctively. Last night, there was much anger. The chief said, "You must understand, to the Apache, a life saved is a heavy thing. It unbalances the world. If Taza had died, his spirit would be gone. But he lives because of your hands. That life now belongs to you and yours to us. It is a circle. You cannot step out of it just because you do not like the shape." Luke set the bowl down. "I understand debts. Nantan, I have paid plenty in my time. But marriage? To a woman who looks at me like she wants to cut my throat? That doesn't bridge any gap. That just digs a deeper ditch. Nantan smiled, a faint, dry expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. Ayana has a heart like a thunderstorm. It is loud and dangerous, but it brings rain to the dry earth. She hates because she has loved and lost. To bind you to her is to force her to see that not all white men are devils, and it forces you to see that we are not animals. A shadow fell over them. Luke looked up to see Ayana standing there. She wore a dress of buckskin that was soft and worn, stained with the dust of the trail. Her hair was pulled back, revealing the sharp, elegant lines of her face. She held a basket of roots against her hip, her posture rigid. "Do not speak for me. Father," she said, her voice cold, "and do not speak of me to him." She turned her gaze on Luke. It was a physical weight. "You eat our food," she said. "You breathe our air, but you will never be one of us. You smell of the army." Nantan sighed. "Ayana, he was a scout, was he not?" Ayana demanded, stepping closer. "Look at the way he sits. Look at his boots. Government issue. Worn down but recognizable. He is not just a cowboy. He is a tracker of men." Luke looked down at his boots. There was no point in lying. The truth was the only thing he had left, even if it damned him. "She is right," Luke said quietly. Nantan went still. Ayana let out a sharp breath, a sound of vindication. "I scouted for the 3rd Cavalry," Luke said, keeping his eyes on the fire. 2 years. I signed on because I was broke and hungry, and they told me it was about keeping the peace, protecting settlers." He looked up, meeting Ayana's furious gaze. "I didn't know what that meant until the winter of '74. We hit a camp in the Tonto Basin. They weren't a war party. They were starving. Old men, women." Luke's voice dropped, rough with the gravel of memory. "I saw what the Gatling guns did. I saw what the soldiers did after the shooting stopped. The laughter, the trophies. I realized then that I wasn't keeping the peace. I was helping to wipe a people off the earth." "And so you ran?" Ayana asked, her lip curling. "Like a coward." "I walked away," Luke said. "I deserted in the middle of a snowstorm. I left my pay, my rank, and my soul back there. I have been running ever since." Ayana stared at him. The contempt in her eyes was still there, hot and bright, but something else flickered behind it. Confusion, perhaps, or a realization that his shame was as deep as her anger. "A man who betrays his own kind will betray us," she said to her father. "He has no honor." Nantan looked at Luke with a grim, heavy expression. "A man who sees a wrong and turns away from it shows a different kind of honor," the chief said. "It takes courage to walk into the snow alone." He stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. "You are here, Luke Carver. You cannot go back to them. They will hang you as a deserter. You cannot leave us. My warriors will kill you. You are trapped in the middle." Nantan looked from Luke to his daughter. "Here are the terms. You will stay with us for 1 season. Through the winter. You will work. You will hunt. You will help us survive the cold and the soldiers. You will live as an Apache. If, when the snow melts and the grass is green, Ayana still refuses you, I will reconsider the bond." Ayana opened her mouth to argue, but Nantan raised a hand. "That is the word of the chief." She clamped her mouth shut, her jaw working furiously. She glared at Luke one last time, a promise of misery, and turned on her heel, marching away toward the creek. Luke let out a long breath. A season. 3 months of winter in a hostile camp with a woman who hated him and a chief who owned him. "I will stay," Luke said. "I don't have much choice." "Good," Nantan said. "Now, go see my son. He asks for you." Luke was escorted to a large wickiup near the edge of the circle. The air inside was thick with the smell of sage smoke and crushed juniper berries. Taza lay on a pile of furs, his massive frame taking up most of the space. His leg was propped up, rebandaged with clean cloth. 2 older women were tending to him, wiping his forehead with damp rags. They froze when Luke entered, moving their bodies between him and the injured man like protective bears. Taza grunted something in Apache, his voice weak but commanding. The women hesitated, then stepped back. though they watched Luke's hands closely. Luke knelt beside the warrior. Taza's face was gray with pain, sweat beading on his upper lip, but his eyes were clear. "How is it?" Luke asked, gesturing to the leg. Taza grimaced. "It burns, like fire ants." Luke reached out and gently lifted the edge of the blanket. The swelling was bad, but the color of the flesh wasn't the black of rot. Not yet. He checked the splint he had made. It was holding, but the binding needed tightening. "I need to adjust this," Luke said, miming the motion. Taza nodded. Luke worked quickly. His hands felt clumsy and large under the scrutiny of the women. He tightened the rawhide strips, checking the circulation. Taza hissed through his teeth, his hand gripping the furs until his knuckles turned white. But he didn't cry out. When Luke was finished, he sat back. "You are strong," Luke said. "You'll keep the leg if the fever stays down." Taza looked at him. He pointed a finger at Luke's chest. "Father says, you marry sister." Luke rubbed the back of his neck. "That's the idea. She isn't too keen on it." Taza made a sound that might have been a laugh or a cough. "Ayana is sharp rock. Cut you if you hold too tight." He leaned his head back. "Exhausted. You stay. No one hurts you. I say this." Luke nodded. "Thanks. Taza." He left the tent feeling a strange weight settle on his shoulders. He had a protector, of sorts. But protection wasn't acceptance. The days began to blur into a rhythm of survival. Luke was put to work. He chopped wood until his blisters broke and calloused over. He carried water. He scraped hides until his arms burned. He was given a corner of a wickiup belonging to an old woman named Che, who had lost her sons to the war and seemed to view Luke as a strange, hairless pet that needed feeding. He began to learn the language. It started with Che pointing at things and waiting. "Two," she would say, holding out a water gourd. "Two," Luke would repeat. She would cackle at his pronunciation, her toothless mouth wide, and correct him. A young boy, no more than 7, began to shadow him. He was shy, hiding behind bushes, but eventually curiosity won out. He would point to a horse and whisper, "Loon, loon," Luke would say. The boy would giggle and cover his mouth. "Lil Lee," he would correct. "Lil Lee." Luke would smile. "Lil Lee." It was a small thing, this exchange of words, but it made the hostility of the rest of the camp bearable. However, whenever Ayana was near, the temperature seemed to drop. She never spoke to him. She would stand with her arms crossed, watching him stumble over the guttural sounds, her expression unreadable but distinctly cold. She refused to help him. If he asked for a tool or a direction, she would look through him as if he were made of glass. 2 weeks into his captivity, the rhythm broke. It was mid-afternoon. The sun was high and pale. Luke was repairing a corral fence when a whistle pierced the air, sharp, 3 short blasts. The camp exploded into motion. It wasn't the domestic bustle of morning. This was panic controlled by drill-like discipline. Mothers grabbed children. Warriors grabbed rifles. Luke stood up, scanning the ridge. He saw the scout riding down, his horse lathered. He spoke rapidly to Nantan. Luke moved toward the chief. A warrior stepped in his way, a knife drawn. Luke pushed past him, ignoring the blade. "Soldiers?" Luke asked Nantan. Nantan looked at him, his face grim. "A patrol, 10 miles east, coming fast." Luke looked at the terrain. The camp was in a depression, hidden from casual view, but if they were sweeping the grid, they would find it. "How many?" Luke asked. 2 score, the scout said in Apache. 40 men, Nantan translated. "They are looking for water," Luke said instantly. His mind shifted back to his army days. He saw the map in his head. If they are 10 miles east, they are coming from the fort. They will stick to the low ground where the washes are. They won't ride the ridges in this wind. He pointed to the north. They will swing wide around the black rocks to avoid the scree. If you run south, you will run right into their flank. Nantan studied him. "You are sure?" "I know the captain who runs patrols in this sector," Luke said. "Captain Harlan, he likes flat ground. He hates losing horses to broken legs. If you want to vanish, you have to go up, into the rocks where the horses can barely walk." Nantan hesitated for a heartbeat. Then he turned to his sub-chiefs. Strike the camp. We go to the high canyon. The evacuation was a miracle of speed. Within 20 minutes, the wiki-ups were dismantled. The poles dragged behind horses. The fires were doused and buried. Brush was swept over the tracks. Luke was given a horse, an old, sway-backed mare, but no weapon. He rode near the rear of the column. As they climbed the steep, rocky trail leading into the mountains, the wind began to howl. It was a brutal ascent. Horses scrambled for footing on the shale. Luke found himself riding beside Ayanna. She was struggling with a pack horse that was fighting the lead rope. Luke spurred his mare forward and grabbed the rope, steadying the animal. Ayanna glared at him, snatching the rope back. "I do not need your help. You're welcome," Luke muttered. They rode in silence for a mile. The trail narrowed, forcing them leg to leg. Luke was constantly twisting in his saddle, his eyes scanning the back trail, then the ridgeline above them, then the horizon. His body was coiled tight, his hand resting instinctively on his thigh where a gun should be. Ayanna watched him. She saw the sweat on his neck despite the cold. She saw the way his eyes never stopped moving. It was a look she knew. It was the look of a hunted animal, or a hunter expecting a trap. "You ride like you expect a bullet," she said. "I expect what I know," Luke replied without looking at her. "Harlan is persistent. If he finds a sign, he won't stop until sunset." "You fear him," she said. "You are one of them, but you fear them." "I fear what happens when two sides stop seeing each other as people," Luke said. "That's when the dying starts." She fell silent, watching the tension in his shoulders. For the first time, she did not see a monster. She saw a man who was terrified, not for himself, but for the column of women and children ahead of them. They reached the hidden canyon just as the sun failed. It was a narrow slash in the earth, protected by overhanging cliffs. It was safe, but it was cold. The wind funneled through the rock walls like water through a chute. No fires were allowed that night. The risk of the light or smoke being seen was too great. The tribe huddled together for warmth. Luke sat apart, wrapped in his thin coat, shivering. The altitude was higher here, and the cold was a physical weight crushing his chest. He rubbed his arms, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. He closed his eyes, trying to sleep, but the shivering kept him awake. He heard soft footsteps. He didn't open his eyes, expecting a guard to check his bonds. Something heavy dropped onto the ground beside him. Then, the warmth of a small, shielded fire flared to life. Luke opened his eyes. Ayanna was kneeling there, arranging a small pile of dry wood in a hollow of the rocks where the glow wouldn't be seen from below. She struck a flint and blew on the tinder. "What are you doing?" Luke asked, his voice shaking. She didn't look at him. "If you freeze to death, my father will say I failed my duty, and you are too heavy to carry back down the mountain." She fed the fire until it was a steady, warm presence. Then she sat back on her heels, wrapping her blanket tight around her. Luke held his hands out to the heat. It felt like salvation. "Thank you," he said. She stared into the small flames. "Why did you really leave the army?" she asked suddenly. Luke hesitated. He looked at the fire, seeing the faces of the past in the embers. "Because I was tired of being part of the lie," he said. "They told us we were bringing civilization, but I looked around and saw we were just bringing death. I couldn't wash the blood off my hands anymore." "You think leaving washes it off?" she asked, her voice hard. "You think because you do not wear the blue coat, you are innocent? My mother died because of men like you. My brother walks with a limp because of men like you." "I know," Luke said, "and I can't fix that. I can't bring them back." "Then what good are you?" she whispered. "I don't know," Luke admitted. "But I'm here, and today, I helped you run, I helped you hide." He looked at her across the fire. The flames illuminated the sharp angles of her face, the darkness of her eyes. "I can't undo the past, Ayanna, but I can choose who I stand with now. And right now, I'm standing with you, whether you want me to or not." Ayanna looked at him for a long moment. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken grief. She didn't offer forgiveness. She didn't smile. But she didn't leave. She reached out and added another stick to the fire. "Keep the fire small," she said, "and do not let it die." She stood up and walked away into the darkness, leaving Luke alone with the warmth she had given him. 3 days later, the winter arrived in earnest. It wasn't just a cold front. It was a storm that buried the high country in 3 feet of white powder. The canyon became a prison. The wind howled for 2 days straight, piling drifts against the canyon walls. When the sky finally cleared, the world was blindingly white and deadly silent. The food stores, already low from the hasty retreat, began to run out. The dried meat was gone. The corn was running low. Hunger settled over the camp. It was a dull, gnawing ache in the belly. Luke saw it in the eyes of the children, who stopped playing and sat listlessly by the fires. A council was held. The hunters had to go out. It was dangerous, the snow was deep, and the animals would be yarded up in the dense timber, hard to reach. Luke stood up from his place at the edge of the circle. "I'll go," he said. Nantan looked at him. "You have no snowshoes. You have no weapon. I can make snowshoes," Luke said. "Willow branches and rawhide, and I can track Taza," who was leaning on a crutch, his legs stiff but healing. "Spoke up. He has good eyes. Father, I will take him." "You cannot walk the deep snow, Taza," Nantan argued. "I can ride to the lower ridge," Taza said. "The white man will flush the game. We will shoot." Nantan hesitated, then nodded. "Take 3 others. Bring meat, or we do not survive the moon." The hunting party set out at dawn. It was brutal work. The snowshoes Luke had fashioned kept him on top of the crust, but his legs burned with every step. The cold was intense, freezing the moisture in his nose. They found nothing for hours. The land seemed empty, stripped of life. Then Luke saw it, a disturbance in the snow near a stand of aspens. He knelt, touching the broken crust. Elk, a small herd, moving heavily. He signaled to Taza, who sat on his horse 100 yards back, rifle ready. Luke moved forward, quiet as a ghost. He tracked them for a mile, the signs getting fresher. He could smell the musk of the animals now. He came over a rise and saw them. 5 elk, trapped in a pocket of deep snow against a cliff face. A large bull, 3 cows, and a yearling. Luke signaled the warriors. They moved into position. Gunshots cracked the silence. 2 cows went down instantly. The bull panicked. It turned, thrashing through the drifts, its eyes rolling in terror. It charged directly toward a young warrior named Che, who had missed his shot and was fumbling to reload. The snow was too deep for Che to run. The bull, 700 pounds of muscle and antler, lowered its head to crush him. Luke didn't think. He didn't have a gun. He had a knife at his belt, one Taza had returned to him for the hunt. He lunged. He threw himself off the small ridge, tackling the snowbank in front of the bull. He shouted, waving his arms. A frantic, human explosion of noise. The bull swerved. It was a fraction of a second, but it was enough. The antlers missed Che by inches, catching the fabric of his shirt, but not the flesh. The bull stumbled, off balance in the deep powder. A single shot rang out. The bull collapsed, sliding to a halt 5 feet from Luke. Taza lowered his smoking rifle. Silence returned to the valley, ringing in Luke's ears. Che stared at Luke, his face pale. He looked from the dead bull to the white man who had jumped in front of it. Luke pulled himself out of the snow, brushing the powder from his coat. He was shaking, the adrenaline crash hitting him hard. "You are crazy." "White man," Taza called out, a grin splitting his face. Luke managed a weak smile. "I prefer distraction." They butchered the animals where they fell, quartering the meat to carry it back. It was a bloody, messy business. But to Luke, the smell of raw meat was the smell of life. They returned to the camp at dusk, the horses laden with meat. A cry of joy went up from the people. Luke spent the evening by the fire, helping to skin the bull elk. His hands were raw and red from the cold and the blood, his knife moving with practiced, rhythmic strokes. He was exhausted, every muscle screaming. but he felt a strange sense of satisfaction. He had provided. He had earned his keep. He felt a pair of eyes on him. He looked up. Ayanna was standing a few feet away. She wasn't looking at the meat. She was looking at him. She watched the way his hands moved, sure and steady despite the cold. She saw the blood on his clothes, the exhaustion in the slump of his shoulders. She had heard the story from Che. She knew he had thrown himself in front of the bull. She remembered his words by the fire. "I choose who I stand with now." For the first time, the wall of hatred she had built brick by brick around her heart felt a tremor. It wasn't gone. It wasn't even crumbling yet. But there was a crack, a hairline fracture where the light was getting in. She saw a man who was freezing, starving, and working himself to the bone for people who despised him. She stepped forward, holding a small gourd of warm tallow and herbs, salve for chapped hands. She placed it on the rock beside him. She didn't speak, she didn't smile. She simply set it down and walked away. Luke watched her go. He reached out and touched the gourd. It was warm. He looked up at the stars, bright and hard above the canyon walls. And for the first time in years, the darkness didn't feel quite so absolute. The winter finally broke, not with a sudden snap, but with a slow, agonizing surrender to the sun. The high country, which had been a white tomb for 3 months, began to weep. Snow receded from the south-facing slopes, leaving behind patches of earth that were black and rich with moisture. The silence of the deep freeze was replaced by the constant, musical drip of melting ice and the roar of the creeks swelling with runoff. The tribe moved with the season. They struck the winter camp in the box canyon, leaving behind the piles of ash and the memories of the starvation months, and headed for the high meadows. The journey was a slog through mud that was thick as molasses, sucking at the hooves of the ponies and the moccasins of the walkers. But there was a lightness in the air that had not been there before. The scent of pine resin grew stronger in the warming days, and in the shelter of the rocks, tiny purple wildflowers began to push their heads up through the wet soil. Luke Carver rode near the front of the column, a position that would have been unthinkable 3 months ago. He sat on roan, his bay gelding having regained some flesh with the new spring grass. Across his saddle lay a Winchester rifle. It was not his old one, that had been lost or traded long ago, but one Nantan had given him from the tribe's stores. It was a heavy symbol. That rifle. It meant they no longer believed he would turn it on them. It meant he was, if not a brother, then at least a necessary part of their survival. He watched the land with eyes that had changed. He no longer scanned the horizon solely for his own safety. He scanned it for theirs. He looked for the glint of sun on a soldier's brass button, the dust cloud of a cattle drive, the unnatural straight lines of wagon tracks. The new camp was situated in a high valley, a bowl of green surrounded by granite peaks that scraped the belly of the sky. The water here was clear and cold, tumbling down from the snowpack, and the grazing was good. The horses rolled in the fresh grass, shedding their winter coats in clumps of ragged fur. As the days lengthened, the dynamic between Luke and Ayanna began to shift. It was not a softening, exactly, but a sharpening of focus. The necessary proximity of camp life threw them together. They found themselves repairing the same corral fence, or watering horses at the same bend in the creek. At first, the silence between them was a wall. Then, it became a series of short, tense exchanges. "Pass the rope," she would say, not looking at him. "Here," he would answer, placing it in her hand. But as the sun grew warmer, the words grew more frequent. Ayanna began to ask questions. They were not idle chatter. They were interrogations, driven by a desperate need to understand the enemy that was slowly eating her world. They stood one afternoon by the stream, the water rushing over smooth stones. Luke was scrubbing down a saddle blanket. Ayanna was filling water skins. "Why do they want it all?" she asked suddenly. Luke paused, his hands slick with soap and water. He didn't have to ask who she meant. "They think it is empty," he said. Ayanna looked around at the valley, at the smoke rising from the wickiups, at the herd of ponies grazing. "It is not empty. To them, if it does not have a fence." It is empty, Luke explained, wringing out the heavy wool. They have a hunger. Ayanna. It is not just for land. It is for something they call ownership. She frowned, the concept alien to her tongue. Ownership. How can you own the ground? The ground was here before the first man, and it will be here after the last man dies. Luke sighed, wiping his wet hands on his pants. In their world, in my world, everything is written on paper. Deeds, titles. A man pays gold, and a man in a big house in Washington signs a paper. And suddenly, that man owns the mountains, the water, the trees. He can put a fence around it and shoot anyone who crosses it, but he has never walked it, Ayanna argued, her voice rising with frustration. He does not know where the deer sleep. He does not know the song of the river. It doesn't matter, Luke said grimly. To them, land is money, and money is God. He told her about the towns that were springing up like weeds along the railroad tracks. He described the saloons with their piano music and cheap whiskey, the churches with their steeples pointing at a heaven they ignored on earth, and the banks where men in suits traded lives for numbers in a ledger. He told her about the prejudice that ran through those streets like an open sewer. He told her that to those men, an Apache was not a person with a history and a family, but a varmint, an obstacle to progress that needed to be cleared away like a stump in a field. Ayanna listened, her face pale. She set the waterskin down and looked at the water. My mother died because of that paper, she said quietly. Luke went still. It was the first time she had spoken of her loss without anger, only with a deep, crushing sorrow. It was the smallpox. She continued, her voice devoid of inflection. It came with the blankets the soldiers gave us at the agency. They said it was a gift, a peace offering. My mother wrapped my little sister in one. They were both gone within a week. She looked up at Luke, her eyes dry but burning. My brother, the one before Taza. He tried to take a horse back from a rancher who had built a house on our summer hunting grounds. The rancher shot him in the back. The rancher said my brother was a thief. But how can you steal from a thief? Luke felt the weight of her grief like a stone on his chest. He wanted to reach out to her, to offer some comfort, but the distance between them felt like a canyon filled with ghosts. I am sorry, he said, the words feeling inadequate and small. Sorry does not bring them back, she said. She picked up the heavy waterskin and swung it onto her shoulder. She looked at him, and for a moment, the hatred was gone, replaced by a terrible, weary understanding. You are a white man, Luke Carver, but you have the eyes of someone who has lost things too. She turned and walked back toward the camp, leaving him standing by the rushing water, the sound of the creek, unable to drown out the echo of her pain. The fragile peace of the valley was shattered a week later. It was late afternoon. The sun was dipping toward the western peaks, casting long, golden shadows across the grass. Luke was near the entrance of the valley, checking the snares he had set for rabbits. He was alone, a mile from the main camp. He heard the sound of hooves before he saw them. It was a heavy, clumsy sound, not the rhythmic gait of Apache riders. He moved quickly, scrambling up a rocky outcrop to get a view of the trail below. 5 riders were coming up the draw. They were white men, dusty and trail-worn. They rode with the loose, swaying posture of men who had been drinking from a jug since breakfast. They were laughing, their voices loud and jarring in the quiet air. Luke recognized the type instantly. Drifters, hands from some outfit looking for strays, or maybe just trouble. If they crested the rise, they would see the smoke of the Apache camp. They would see the horses, and they would ride back to town with a story that would bring the cavalry down within 2 days. Luke didn't hesitate. He couldn't let them reach the crest. He checked his rifle, then slid it into the scabbard on his back. He didn't want to start a shooting war if he didn't have to. He pulled his hat low, rubbed dirt on his face to mask the relative cleanliness of his shave, and spurred roan down the slope, intercepting them on the trail. He came around a bend and pulled up, blocking the path. The 5 riders reined in, surprised. Their hands drifted to their guns, but they didn't draw. Well now, the lead rider said. He was a man with a broken nose and a beard stained with tobacco juice. Who might you be? "Just passing through," Luke said, keeping his voice flat and bored. He let his hand rest casually on his thigh. Near the old Colt revolver Nantan had returned to him. "You're a long way from nowhere." "Friend," the rider said, eyeing Luke's horse. "Lost a mule." Luke lied smoothly. "Wandered off 2 days ago. You boys see a sway-backed mule with a crooked ear?" The riders laughed. "We ain't seen nothing but rocks and lizards," one of them shouted. The leader didn't laugh. He squinted at Luke. "You look familiar. I see you in Tucson." "Maybe," Luke said. "I move around." The leader spat a stream of brown juice onto the dust near Roan's hooves. "You got the look of a man who rides the grub line. Or maybe you're one of them squaw lovers I hear about. Living up here in the rocks?" Luke felt a muscle in his jaw jump. He forced himself to smile, a cold, thin expression. "I ride for myself," he said, "and I don't care much for company." The leader chuckled. He nudged his horse forward, crowding Luke. "You smell like smoke. Friend, Indian smoke. I camped in a canyon last night," Luke said, not giving an inch. "The wind blows where it wants." The riders circled him. They were drunk, dangerous, and looking for a fight. They began to throw insults, testing him. They called him filth. They called him a traitor to his race. They described in graphic, vile detail what they would do to an Apache woman if they caught one. Luke sat on his horse, taking it. Every word was a lash. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to draw and fire. He could drop 3 of them before they cleared leather. But the gunshots would alert the camp, and if any of these men escaped, the secret was out. So he sat there. He let them mock him. He let them call him a coward. He let them laugh at his worn coat and his silent endurance. From high up on the ridge, hidden behind a cluster of boulders, Ayanna watched. She had been hunting when she heard the voices. She had her bow drawn. The arrow knocked. She had a clear shot at the leader's chest, but she didn't loose the arrow. She watched Luke. She saw the way his hand hovered over his gun, trembling with the effort of restraint. She saw the whiteness of his knuckles. She heard the words the white men threw at him, words she understood enough of to know they were poison. She realized with a jolt that shocked her to her core. He was taking this for them. He was swallowing his pride, his honor, and his rage to keep the soldiers away from her father, from the children, from her. He was letting himself be small so they could be safe. The leader of the cowboys finally got bored. He realized Luke wasn't going to fight. "You ain't worth the bullet," the man sneered. "Come on, boys. Let's find us some beef that ain't so tough." They turned their horses, but as they rode off, the last rider paused. He looked at the ground. "Hey, boss," he called out. "Look here. Unshod pony tracks. Fresh." The leader looked back, his eyes narrowing. Luke's hand tightened on his reins. If they followed the tracks, he would have to kill them. All of them. "Old tracks," Luke said, his voice hard as iron. "From the rain last week." The rider hesitated, looking at Luke, then at the tracks. The leader spat again. "Let it be. I need a drink more than I need a scalp." They rode off down the valley, their laughter fading into the distance. Luke sat on his horse for a long time, watching them go. He was shaking, not from fear, but from a rage so hot it made his vision blur. He felt dirty. He felt hollowed out. He turned to Roan and rode back toward the camp, unaware that Ayanna was shadowing him from the ridge, her bow lowered, her face a mask of confusion. When he reached the camp, the sun was down. He dismounted near the corral, his movements stiff. Ayanna was waiting for him. She stepped out of the shadows. "You let them go," she said. Luke didn't look at her. He began to unsaddle Roan, jerking the cinch strap loose with unnecessary force. "I got rid of them," he said shortly. "They saw the tracks," Ayanna said, her voice rising. "They will talk. They will tell the soldiers. You should have killed them." Luke spun around. The saddle hit the ground with a heavy thud. "And then what?" he shouted. "Then 5 men don't come back to town? Then the search parties start? Then they come looking for bodies and find us? You are a warrior," she yelled back, stepping into his space. "A warrior does not let men speak to him like that. I heard them. I heard what they called you. You heard?" Luke laughed, a bitter, jagged sound. Then you know what I am to them. I am trash. I am a traitor." He paced away from her, then turned back, his chest heaving. "I stood there and let them spit on me to keep your camp safe. Ayanna, I ate their dirt so you wouldn't have to bury your father. You bring their trouble with you," she accused, though her voice wavered. "Everywhere you go, the white world follows." "Because I can't cut it out of me," Luke roared. The camp had gone silent. People were watching from the fires. Luke didn't care. "I am not one of them anymore," he said, his voice dropping to a desperate rasp. "They hate me, but I am not one of you either. I am nothing. I am just a man standing in the middle getting shot at from both sides." He looked at her, his eyes raw with pain. "I have nowhere. Ayanna, nowhere." He turned and walked away into the deepening twilight, heading toward the high rocks away from the fires. Ayanna stood there, the anger draining out of her, leaving behind a hollow ache she didn't know how to name. That night, the sky broke open. It started with a low rumble that shook the ground, followed by a crack of thunder that sounded like the mountains splitting apart. The rain came down in sheets, cold and violent. Luke was up in the rocks, trying to secure a string of horses that had been picketed in a narrow ravine. The animals were terrified, pulling at their ropes, their eyes rolling white in the darkness. He was soaked to the bone in seconds. The temperature plummeted. He slipped on the wet stone, barking his shin, cursing into the wind. He struggled with a frightened mare, trying to calm her as lightning flashed, illuminating the world in stark, blue-white strobe lights. "Need help." He turned. Ayanna was there. She had thrown a heavy wool blanket over her head, but it was already soaked. She grabbed the mare's lead rope, her hands sure and strong. Together, they wrestled the horses into a semblance of order, tying them securely to the scrub oaks. The rain intensified, turning into hail that stung like buckshot. "Here!" Ayanna yelled over the roar of the storm. She grabbed Luke's sleeve and pulled him toward a dark slash in the cliff face. It was a shallow overhang, barely deep enough for two people, but it was dry. They scrambled inside, collapsing against the back wall of rock. The space was tiny. They were forced to sit shoulder to shoulder, their knees touching. Outside, the world was a chaotic fury of water and noise. Inside, the air was cold and damp, smelling of wet stone and ozone. Luke shivered violently. His shirt was plastered to his skin. Ayanna wasn't much better off. Her buckskin dress was soaked, clinging to her frame. She opened the heavy blanket she had brought and threw half of it over him. "Share warmth," she said, her teeth chattering, "or we die." Luke didn't argue. He pulled the blanket tight around them. They sat huddled together, creating a small pocket of heat in the freezing night. Luke could feel the trembling of her body against his. He could smell the scent of rain and wood smoke in her hair. He felt a sudden, overwhelming awareness of her, not as a symbol, not as a duty, but as a woman. He turned his head. In the dim light, he saw she was looking at him. Her eyes were wide, dark pools reflecting the lightning flashes. "Why did you come up here?" he asked softly. I checked the horses," she stammered. "Liar," Luke whispered. She looked down at her hands. "You were right," she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. "You are not nothing. You." Luke watched her profile. The anger of the afternoon had burned itself out, leaving something raw and exposed. "When I look at you," Luke said, the words tumbling out before he could check them, "I don't see an enemy. I haven't for a long time." Ayanna went still. "What do you see?" Luke swallowed hard. "I see a woman who scares the hell out of me." "Why?" she asked, looking up at him. "Because I want you," he said. "More than I should, more than is safe." Ayanna's breath hitched. She didn't pull away. "I want to trust you," she whispered. "But I am afraid." "Of what?" "Of betraying them," she said, gesturing to the camp below. "Every story I know ends with the white man taking what he wants and leaving ash behind. If I let you in, if I let myself want this, and you leave, I'm not going anywhere," Luke said. He shifted his hand under the blanket. his fingers brushing hers. Her skin was cold, but her palm was warm. She didn't withdraw. She turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers with his. The grip was tight, desperate. The air between them seemed to charge with electricity, mirroring the storm outside. The physical contact was a shock, grounding and terrifying all at once. Ayanna looked at his mouth. Then she looked into his eyes. She was trembling, not from the cold now. Luke leaned in slowly. He gave her every second to stop him. He gave her a dozen chances to turn away. She didn't. She lifted her chin, her eyes closing. When their lips met, it wasn't smooth. It was a collision. It was hesitant, clumsy, with cold lips and chattering teeth. But then the heat took over. Ayanna made a small sound in her throat and gripped the front of his wet shirt, pulling him closer. Luke wrapped his arm around her, holding her as if the wind might snatch her away. The kiss deepened, becoming fierce and hungry. It was the release of months of fear, anger, and proximity. It was a claiming. For a minute, the storm didn't exist. There was only the taste of rain on her skin, the roughness of his unshaven cheek, the desperate, beating life of two people finding sanctuary in each other. Then, Ayanna gasped and pulled back. She pressed her hands against his chest, pushing him away gently but firmly. Her chest was heaving. Her eyes were wide with shock. "No," she whispered. Luke froze. He didn't try to pull her back. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." "No," she said again, shaking her head. "Not like this. Not in secret." She took a ragged breath, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "I will not be a stolen thing. Luke, I will not be a woman you take in the dark and hide in the daylight. If we are to be—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "I understand," Luke said, his voice rough. "It cannot happen again," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Not until my father sees, not until the danger is past. Not until you can stand before the tribe and say it without shame." Luke nodded. He felt a dull ache in his chest, a mixture of rejection and profound respect. "I can wait," he said. Ayanna looked at him, her gaze softening. She reached out and touched his cheek, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. "Do not make me wait too long. Cowboy," she whispered. They sat the rest of the night in silence, huddled under the blanket, listening to the rain slow and stop. They did not kiss again, but their hands remained clasped, an anchor in the dark. The morning brought a gray, washed-out light and a visitor, a traitor, a man known to the Apache as a fair dealer in a land of cheats, rode into the valley leading a pack mule. He was a Mexican man named Chavez, old and wrinkled like a dried apple. Nantan welcomed him. They sat by the fire, smoking. Luke stood nearby, translating when the dialects grew too thick. Chavez brought tobacco and sugar, but he also brought news that made the blood run cold. "There is a man," Chavez said, "speaking in Spanish, a patron, Silas Morgan." Luke stiffened at the name. He knew it. Morgan was a cattle baron from Texas who had moved west with enough money to buy the law and enough hired guns to enforce it. "He is buying the politicians," Chavez said. "He wants the valley. Not this one, but the lower ones, the winter grounds. He has told the army that the Apache are raiding his stock. He is demanding they clear the territory." Luke looked at Nantan. "The men I saw yesterday," Luke said, his voice grim. "They weren't drifters. They were scouts for Morgan. They were checking the perimeter." Nantan's face was a mask of stone. "And the army?" Chavez shrugged. "Captain Harlan is a man who likes gold more than peace. Morgan has promised a railroad spur. That means money for everyone, except you." When Chavez left, the mood in the camp was darker than the storm clouds. A council was called. Nantan, Taza, the sub-chiefs, and Luke sat in a circle. Ayanna sat just outside the ring, listening. "We must run," one elder said, "into the deep mountains of Mexico." "We will starve there," Taza argued, slapping his bad leg. "And the Mexicans will hunt us too. We should fight, make them bleed for every inch. They have Gatling guns." Luke said quietly. And cannons. If you fight them head on, Taza, you will die. All of you. Then what? Taza demanded, turning on Luke. You are the white man. How do we beat a man who buys the world? Luke looked at the circle of faces. He felt the weight of their survival on his back. Morgan is a businessman, Luke said. He doesn't want a war. War is expensive. He wants a slaughter. He wants you gone quietly. Luke looked up and met Ayana's eyes across the circle. He remembered the kiss in the cave. He remembered the promise he had made. We don't run, Luke said, and we don't attack. Not yet. We prepare. If Morgan wants this land, we make it too expensive for him to take. Nantan watched Luke closely. You speak as if you are leading this war. Luke Carver. Luke looked at the chief. I am not leading it, Nantan, but I know how they think. And if you want to save your daughter, and your people, you need someone who knows the enemy. Nantan nodded slowly. Then we listen. As the council broke up and the tribe began to prepare for a siege they couldn't yet see, Luke walked toward the horses. He passed Ayana. They didn't stop. They didn't touch. But the air between them was thick enough to choke on. The unspoken desire, the memory of the storm, and the looming threat bound them together tighter than any marriage vow. Trouble is coming, Luke murmured as he passed her. I know, she replied, her voice steady. But we are not alone this time. She walked on, her head high, and Luke watched her go, knowing that he would burn the whole world down before he let Silas Morgan touch a hair on her head. Summer fell upon the territory like a heavy iron hammer heated in a forge. The high meadows, which only weeks before had been lush with spring grass and wildflowers, began to yellow and brittle under the relentless assault of the sun. The sky was a bleached dome of white-hot light, devoid of clouds, where vultures circled in lazy, patient spirals, waiting for the land to give up its dead. In the Apache camp, the heat brought a suffocating tension. The creek, once a roaring torrent of snowmelt, had dwindled to a sluggish ribbon of brown water that barely covered the stones. Dust hung in the air, a fine grit that coated everything, skin, food, weapons, and rose in choking clouds with every hoofstep of the ponies. The tribe was on edge. Game had moved higher into the timber to escape the flies and the heat, making hunting difficult. But the greater threat was not the hunger. It was the encroaching circle of iron and lead. Patrols were seen almost daily now, lines of blue-coated soldiers riding along the ridge lines, their sabers glinting like mirrors. And worse were the riders who did not wear uniforms, the hard-eyed men who worked for Silas Morgan, scouting the canyons, searching for the holdout band that stood in the way of the cattle baron's ambition. Luke Carver wiped sweat from his eyes as he saddled Roan. The leather was hot to the touch. Beside him, Nantan adjusted the girth on his paint pony. The chief looked older in the harsh light, the lines of his face carved deep like dry riverbeds. But his back was straight. We go unarmed? Luke asked, though he knew the answer. We go to talk, Nantan said. If we carry rifles into the town, we do not talk, we die. They were riding to Fort Verde, the nearest settlement where Captain Harlan maintained his headquarters. It was a desperate gamble. Nantan hoped that a direct appeal to the Army's honor might buy them time, or a guaranteed sanctuary. Luke knew better, but he also knew that without an attempt at diplomacy, the end would be bloody and absolute. I will ride with you, a voice said. They turned. Ayana stood there, holding the reins of her mare. She wore a wide-brimmed straw hat she had traded for, pulled low to shade her eyes. No, Nantan said. It is too dangerous. If you do not return, Ayana said, her voice flat and hard. Who will tell the people what happened? I will not sit here and wait for a riderless horse. I will watch from the ridge. I will see what truth the white man speaks. Nantan looked at Luke. Luke nodded slightly. He knew there was no stopping her. Stay back, Luke warned her. Out of sight. If things go wrong, you turn and ride. You don't look back. They rode out in silence, a grim procession of three moving through the shimmering heat waves. The town of Verde was a scar on the desert floor, a collection of adobe buildings and rough-hewn timber shacks huddled around the dusty parade grounds of the military outpost. As Luke and Nantan rode down the main street, the noise of the town, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the shout of a mule skinner, the tinny piano from a saloon seemed to falter and die. People stopped in the street. Men stepped out of the shade of overhangs, their hands drifting to their belts. Women pulled children behind their skirts. The hostility was a physical weight, pressing against Luke's chest. He felt the sting of their eyes. He saw the shopkeeper in a stained apron spit onto the boardwalk as they passed. He heard the whispers, loud enough to be meant for his ears. Look at him, traitor, red-loving trash. Should string him up right next to the savage. Luke kept his eyes forward, staring between Roan's ears. He felt a burning shame, not for himself, but for the hatred that radiated from his own people. He felt more foreign here, on this street lined with English signs and American flags, than he did in the wickiup of the Apache. Ayanna had pulled off the road a half-mile back, tying her horse in a stand of mesquite and creeping forward on foot to the rear of the command post. She found a spot behind a stack of crates near the back door, where a window was propped open to catch the faint breeze. She crouched there, listening, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Inside the office, the air was stagnant and smelled of stale cigar smoke and old paper. Captain Harlan sat behind a heavy oak desk, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. He was a thick-set man with a mustache waxed into sharp points and eyes that were as cold and flat as a snake's. Luke stood before the desk, hat in hand. Nantan stood beside him, silent and imposing even in his worn buckskins. "Captain," Luke said, keeping his voice steady, "you remember me." Harlan smiled, but it was a smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Carver, I remember. Best scout in the regiment, until you decided the mountains suited you better than your oath." "I didn't leave because of the mountains," Luke said. "I left because I didn't sign up to butcher starving families." Harlan waved a hand dismissively. "War is ugly. Carver, you know that. Civilization requires a strong stomach. We are not here to talk of the past," Nantan said, his voice deep and resonating in the small room. "We are here to talk of the valley. My people are hungry. We want peace. We will stay in the high rocks. We will not raid the cattle, but we cannot go to the reservation. The water there is poison and the ground is dead." Harlan leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking. "It is not up to me." "Chief," Harlan said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "The territory is changing. Progress is coming. The railroad, new settlers. Silas Morgan." Luke cut in. Harlan's eyes flicked to Luke, sharpening. "Mr. Morgan is a prominent citizen," Harlan said. "He has purchased the grazing rights to the entire basin, including your high valley. He has the deeds, signed and stamped by the territorial governor. He bought land people are living on," Luke said, his grip on his hat tightening until the felt began to tear. "He bought public land," Harlan corrected. "And as far as the law is concerned, the Apache have no claim to it. They are squatters, dangerous squatters." Luke stepped forward, placing his hands on the desk. "Captain, these people saved my life. They have honored their word. If you send Morgan's men in there, it won't be a relocation. It will be a massacre. You know how Morgan operates." Harlan stood up, his face hardening. "Careful. Carver, you are walking a very thin line. You are already a deserter. Do not add traitor to the list. If you are found with them when the sweep begins, I cannot guarantee your safety. In fact, I might have to order my men to treat you as a combatant." "So that is it?" Luke asked, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "You just wash your hands of it?" "I follow orders," Harlan said, "and my orders are to secure the safety of the settlers. The Apache must go, to the reservation, or to the grave. It is their choice." Luke looked at the man he had once saluted. He saw no honor there, only ambition and fear. "Come, Nantan," Luke said. "There is nothing here for us." As they turned to leave, Harlan called out, "Carver, do yourself a favor. Ride south, alone. Don't die for a lost cause." Luke didn't look back. Outside, crouched by the window, Ayanna felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had heard the scratch of the pen on paper. She had heard the casual way the white captain traded their lives for grazing rights. It confirmed every dark story she had ever been told. The law was a lie. The paper was a weapon. She slipped away into the shadows, her hatred for this system crystallizing into something sharp and deadly. But as she moved, she also thought of Luke's voice in that room, defending them, challenging his own chief, risking his life to speak truth to power. He was an exile, just like them. Luke and Nantan walked back to their horses. The heat seemed even more oppressive now. As they passed the Batwing Saloon, the sound of loud, boisterous laughter spilled out through the swinging doors. Luke paused. He recognized the voice. It was a rough, gravelly baritone he had heard on the ridge weeks ago. "We hit 'em at dawn. Boys," the voice bellowed. "The sweep starts Thursday. We're gonna flush that vermin out of the rocks like rats. $5 for every scalp." Luke froze. Thursday? That was 2 days from now. Nantan had heard it too. He looked at Luke, his face unreadable. "We ride," Nantan said softly. They mounted and rode out of town, keeping a slow pace until they were clear of the buildings, then spurring their horses into a gallop. Ayana joined them a mile out, emerging from the brush on her mare. She didn't ask what happened. She had heard enough. The return journey was a race against despair. When they reached the camp, the sun was setting, turning the sky into a bruised purple bruise. A council was called immediately. The firelight flickered on the faces of the warriors, highlighting the fear and the anger etched there. Taza sat with his rifle across his knees, his eyes burning. "We fight!" Taza roared, striking the ground with his fist. "If they want this valley, they will pay for it in blood. We ambush them in the pass. We kill them all." "There are too many," Luke said. He stood in the center of the circle, exhausted, dust caking his face. "Morgan has 50 men. Harlan will send 20 soldiers with a Gatling gun to support them. If you stand and fight toe-to-toe, you will be wiped out." "Then we die like men," Taza shouted. "Better that than to be herded like sheep to the reservation. Think of the children," Luke shot back. "Think of the women. If the warriors die, who protects them?" Silence fell over the circle. "I have a plan," Luke said. "It is risky, but it gives us a chance." "Speak," Nantan said. "We move the women, the children, and the elders tonight," Luke explained. "There is a ravine 3 miles north, narrow and hidden. We hide them there. Then, a small group of us, maybe 10 men, we stay here. We light the fires. We make noise. We draw them in. And then," Taza asked suspiciously. "We hold the pass," Luke said. "Just long enough to make them think the whole tribe is fighting. We make them commit their force. Then, we slip away through the goat trails on the back ridge. We lead them on a chase into the Badlands, away from the families. It is a coward's way." Taza spat, running and hiding. "It is a survivor's way," Luke said. The warriors muttered. It went against their instinct to run from a fight they had been waiting for. Taza shook his head, preparing to argue again. "I agree with Luke." The voice was clear and steady. Ayana stepped into the firelight. The tribe turned to look at her. It was rare for a woman to speak in the war council, but she was the chief's daughter, and her face was set in stone. Taza looked at his sister. "Shocked? You? You who hates the white man more than any of us? You side with him?" "I hate them," Ayana said, her eyes flashing. "I hate them for what I heard today in their town. I hate them for trading our land for paper. But I love our people more than I hate our enemies." She looked at Taza, then at her father. "If we stand and fight, we die, all of us. My mother's line ends. Your line ends. Our stories end. Luke's plan gives us a tomorrow. Pride is a heavy shield, brother, but it does not stop a cannon shell." Nantan looked at his daughter with a strange mix of sorrow and pride. He saw the strength in her, the leadership that had been forged in loss. "She is right," Nantan said. "We will follow the white man's plan. Taza, you will choose 10 men to stand with Luke. I will take the families to the ravine." The council broke up, the camp dissolving into frantic, silent activity. Late that night, the camp was a ghost of itself. The wickiup stood empty. The women and children had melted away into the darkness hours ago. Only the small group of defenders remained, waiting for the dawn. Luke walked down to the stream to splash water on his face. He felt hollowed out, vibrating with adrenaline and fatigue. The moon was full, casting a silver path across the black water. He sensed her before he saw her. Ayanna stood on the bank. She should have gone with the women, but she had stayed behind to bring extra ammunition to the defenders before leaving. "You should be in the ravine," Luke said softly. "I am going," she said. She stepped closer. The moonlight caught the tears standing in her eyes, tears she refused to let fall. "You are staying to hold the pass," she said. "It is a suicide post. We have good cover." Luke lied. "We'll be fine." She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were trembling. "I heard you today," she whispered. "In the office. I heard you fight for us. You risked your life to speak for people who have treated you like a prisoner. They are my people now," Luke said. The barrier between them, eroded by months of shared hardship and the storm in the cave, finally crumbled completely. The fear of tomorrow stripped away the hesitation of today. Luke pulled her to him. It wasn't gentle this time. It was a collision of two people standing on the edge of a cliff. Ayanna threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in the hollow of his shoulder. Luke wrapped his arms around her waist, holding her so tight it was hard to breathe. "Luke," she breathed against his neck. They clung to each other, swaying slightly. The desire that surged between them was overwhelming, a fierce, hot demand to feel life before facing death. Luke's hand tangled in her hair, tilting her head back, their foreheads pressed together, eyes closed, breathing in the scent of each other. "I want to stay," she whispered. "I want to fight beside you." "No," Luke said, his voice rough with emotion. "If I know you are safe, I can fight. If you are here, I will be looking at you, not the enemy." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. The moonlight made them look like obsidian. He wanted to kiss her. He wanted to pull her down into the grass and forget the war, but he saw the resolve in her face, the conditions she had set that night in the cave. No shame. "Ayanna," Luke said, his voice steady and solemn, "if we get through this, if I walk off that ridge tomorrow, I'm going to ask Nantan for you, in front of everyone. I am going to marry you, and I don't care if every white man in the territory spits on me." Ayanna's breath hitched. She placed her palm against his chest, over his heart. "And I will say yes," she promised, "whether we are in a wickiup or a house, or sleeping under the stars. I will be your wife." She leaned in and kissed him once, hard, quick, and searing with promise. Then she pulled away, her hand lingering in his for a second before she turned and ran into the darkness to join the retreating families. Luke stood alone by the water, touching his lips, feeling the phantom warmth of her. Then he picked up his rifle and walked back to the barricades. The attack came with the sun. The first sign was the dust, a long, low cloud rolling up the valley floor, stained pink by the dawn light. Then came the rumble of hooves, a sound that vibrated in the soles of Luke's boots where he lay prone behind a cluster of boulders at the narrowest point of the pass. Taza lay beside him, checking the action on his Winchester. "Steady," Luke whispered. "Let them come into the bottle." Morgan's men rode confidently. They expected to find sleeping victims. Not a kill zone. They rode in a loose formation, rifles resting on their thighs, laughing. At 200 yards, Luke sighted on the man in the lead, the foreman with the loud voice. "Now!" Luke yelled. 10 rifles cracked as one. The volley was devastating. 3 riders went down instantly. Horses screamed and reared, throwing men into the dust. The foreman's horse collapsed, pinning him. Panic erupted in the valley. The cattlemen scrambled for cover, returning fire blindly at the rocks. "Hold the line," Luke shouted, working the lever of his rifle. For an hour, it was chaos. Bullets chipped stone fragments into their faces. The air filled with the acrid smell of black powder and blood. Taza fought like a demon, moving from rock to rock, firing, reloading, and firing again. He moved with a grace that belied his injured leg, his war cry echoing off the canyon walls. But then the soldiers arrived. They didn't charge. They set up a position 500 yards back. Luke heard the distinctive mechanical cranking sound that chilled his blood. "Gatling!" Luke screamed. "Get down!" The gun opened up. It sounded like a giant canvas ripping. Hundreds of rounds a minute tore into the rocks, shredding the brush, pulverizing the stone. Luke curled into a ball as rock shards rained down on him. A sudden, white-hot impact spun him around. He gasped, clutching his left shoulder. Blood oozed between his fingers. It was a flesh wound, deep, but it hadn't hit the joint. "We have to move!" Taza yelled over the roar. "They are flanking us!" Luke peered over the rock. He saw a detachment of riders climbing the scree slope to the east, bypassing their position. They weren't trying to flank the defenders. They were heading for the ravine. "They know!" Luke realized with horror. "They found the tracks of the women!" "Fall back!" Luke screamed. "To the ravine!" They abandoned the pass, scrambling back toward the horses they had hidden. They rode hard, blood dripping from Luke's arm, fear driving them faster than the pain. They reached the entrance to the hidden ravine just as the second group of Morgan's men crested the ridge. The ambush was already happening. Luke saw the scene in fragments of nightmare clarity. The women and children were scattering, running for the caves. Nantan was there, standing in the open, firing an old pistol to draw fire away from a group of mothers. Ayana was running toward a child who had frozen in terror in the middle of the wash. A little girl, no more than 5. A rider, a man in a dusty duster, raised his rifle, aiming at the child. Nantan moved. He didn't run, he threw himself. He covered the distance with the last burst of strength in his old body, stepping in front of the child just as the rifle cracked. Nantan jerked back as if hit by a sledgehammer. He fell, covering the child with his body. "Father!" The scream tore out of Ayana's throat. It was a sound so full of agony, it seemed to stop the battle for a heartbeat. It hit Luke in the chest harder than the bullet had. Taza let out a roar of grief and charged the rider, shooting him out of the saddle at point-blank range. The defenders from the pass poured fire into the attackers, fueled by a rage that went beyond survival. Caught between the new arrivals and the difficult terrain, Morgan's men faltered. They had lost their element of surprise and their easy targets. When 2 more of them dropped, the rest wheeled their horses and fled, retreating back toward the main force. The guns fell silent. The dust began to settle. Luke slid from his horse, his legs giving way. He stumbled toward the center of the wash. Ayana was on the ground, cradling her father's head in her lap. Nantan's chest was a ruin of blood. His breath came in wet, shallow rattles. Taza stood over them, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face, his rifle hanging limp in his hand. Luke fell to his knees beside them. Nantan's eyes fluttered open. He looked at Ayana. He reached up a trembling hand to touch her face. "Do not let the hate eat you," he whispered, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "Live, Ayana. Lead them. Choose life." His eyes shifted to Luke. He saw the wound on Luke's shoulder. He saw the grief in the white man's eyes. Nantan's hand moved from Ayana's face and blindly sought Luke's. Luke took it. The old hand squeezed with a surprising, final strength. It was a transfer of weight, a silent command. "Take care of them," the grip said. Then the strength vanished. Nantan's hand went slack, his eyes fixed on the blue sky above the canyon walls. Ayana went rigid. She didn't wail, she didn't cry out again. She stared at her father's face, and Luke watched as something in her broke and then instantly hardened into ice. She slowly lowered her father's head to the ground. She stood up. Her dress was stained with his blood. "Ayana," Luke whispered, reaching out to her. She flinched away from his touch as if he were made of fire. She looked at him. Her eyes were empty. The warmth, the promise, the love they had shared by the stream the night before, it was all gone, buried under the body of the chief. "You brought this," she said. Her voice was a dead thing. "Ayana." "No," Luke pleaded. "We tried. Your plan," she said. Your world! Your bullets!" She looked around at the broken bodies in the dust, at the smoke beginning to rise from the brush where a stray spark had landed. She looked back at Luke. She looked at his white skin, his blue eyes, the army boots he still wore. She didn't see the man who had held her. She saw the enemy. She saw the reason her father was dead. "Don't touch me," she whispered. She turned her back on him and walked toward Taza, beginning to issue orders in a voice that was cold, sharp, and terrifyingly calm. Luke knelt in the bloody dust, clutching his wounded shoulder, watching the woman he loved turn into a stranger. He had saved the tribe, perhaps, but he had lost everything else. The valley, once a place of hope, felt desecrated, and the silence that followed was louder than the guns. The retreat was a march through the throat of hell. They left the broken bodies of their dead in the shallow graves of the ravine, covered with heavy stones to keep the coyotes at bay, and pushed upward into the spine of the mountains. The land here was not the rolling high meadows of spring. It was a jagged, unforgiving fortress of granite and scree, where the air grew thin and the wind carried the taste of ice even in the height of summer. The horses suffered first. Their hooves cracked on the razor-sharp shale, and their ribs began to show through their dusty coats as the grazing dwindled to patches of tough, bitter scrub. Water was scarce, found only in deep, shadowed crevices where the sun could not reach to steal it. Luke Carver rode near the rear, his left arm bound tight against his chest in a sling made from a torn strip of blanket. His shoulder throbbed with a dull, sickening rhythm, a constant reminder of the bullet he had taken. But the pain in his body was nothing compared to the silence that walked beside him. The tribe was broken. Nantan was gone. The spiritual center of their world had been punched out by a rifle bullet, and the grief was a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered even the children's cries. Yet, in that vacuum of leadership, a new strength began to solidify. Ayanna did not weep. Her eyes were rimmed with red, the skin beneath them bruised with exhaustion, but her voice never wavered. She moved through the ragged column like a spirit of iron. When a horse stumbled, she was there to help the rider up. When a child cried for water, she was the one who rationed the precious drops from the skin, whispering soft words that seemed to settle the panic. Luke watched her from a distance, torn between a profound admiration and a guilt that felt like acid in his gut. She was Nantan's daughter, in every way that mattered. She had taken the weight of the tribe onto her shoulders without being asked. The elders watched her, their faces grim, and slowly, instinctively, they began to turn to her for the nod to stop, the order to camp, the decision to ration the dried meat. She did not look at Luke. Since the moment in the ravine when she had recoiled from his touch, she had treated him like a ghost, someone who was there, but not part of the living world. They camped on a high, desolate plateau 3 days into the retreat. The wind howled through the rocks, drowning out the sound of the few small fires they dared to light. A council was called, not with ceremony, but out of desperation. Taza sat by the fire, his face a mask of war paint that he had not washed off since the battle. He looked wild, his eyes feverish with a need for violence that had nowhere to go. "We go back," Taza said, his voice a rasping growl. "We leave the women here, the men ride down. We burn Morgan's ranch to the ground. We kill his cattle. We kill his men. We kill until there is no one left to hold a rifle." A murmur of agreement went through the circle of warriors. They were hurting. They wanted blood to pay for blood. "That is suicide," Luke said. He spoke quietly from the edge of the light. The warriors turned to him, their expressions hostile. Taza's hand dropped to the knife at his belt. "You speak," Taza snarled. "You? Whose plan put my father in the ground?" "My plan saved the tribe from extinction," Luke said, stepping into the light. He forced himself to stand straight, ignoring the fire in his shoulder. "If you had fought in the pass, you would all be dead. If we attack the ranch now," Luke continued, looking around the circle, "you play right into Morgan's hand. He has 50 men fortified in that house. He has the army on patrol. You ride down there, Taza, and you leave these women widows before the moon changes. Then what?" Taza shouted, standing up. "We sit here and starve? We wait for the snow to kill us? No, Luke said. We fight, but not with bullets. Not yet. He took a breath, knowing that what he was about to say sounded insane. Morgan is winning because he has the law, Luke said. He has the deeds. He has the army believing he is the victim. He is a businessman. To hurt him. You don't shoot his cows. You destroy his money. You destroy his name. Taza spat on the ground. White man's tricks. Paper does not stop a bullet. It does in my world. Luke said. He looked at Ayanna. She was sitting across the fire, watching him. Her face was unreadable in the flickering light. Morgan is holding a meeting in town. Luke said, I heard the men talking during the fight. He is meeting with the town council and Harlan to sign the final removal agreement. If he gets those signatures, the army will bring cannons to these mountains. We need to stop that meeting, Luke said. We need to prove that Morgan is lying. We need to prove he bribed Harlan. We need to show the town that he isn't a pioneer, but a thief who is stealing their land too. And how do we do that? Taza asked, mocking. Do we walk into town and ask nicely? I go in, Luke said. I find the proof. I know how men like Morgan keep their books. There is always a record. There is always a witness who wasn't paid enough to keep his mouth shut. You will be hanged the moment you step on the street, Taza said. Not if I am not alone, Luke said. Not if I am just a drifter passing through with his wife. He looked directly at Ayanna. We go in disguised. We get the proof. We bring it to the meeting. And while I am in that room, you, Taza, take the warriors and hit his supply wagons outside of town. You don't kill the drivers. You burn the wagons. You cripple his wallet while I cripple his reputation. Taza looked at Luke, then at his sister. He is mad. Taza said, Ayanna, tell him he is mad. Ayanna stood up. The blanket slipped from her shoulders. She looked at Taza, then at the fire, and finally at Luke. Blood calls for blood, she said softly. That is the Apache way. Taza nodded, vindicated. But, she continued, her voice gaining strength, Father said to choose survival. If we attack the ranch, we die. If we do nothing, we die. She walked around the fire until she stood before Luke. She looked into his face, searching for the truth of him, searching for the man she had almost given herself to before the world fell apart. You believe this can work? She asked. I believe it is the only chance we have, Luke answered. Then I will go, she said. The camp was silent. Taza stared at her, his mouth open. You will walk into the den of the wolves? Taza asked. I will walk where I must, Ayanna said, to save what is left. The preparation was a somber affair. They had looted some clothes from a settler's wagon months ago, keeping them for trade. Now, they were weapons. Ayanna retired to a small shelter to change. When she emerged, Luke felt his breath catch in his throat. She wore a faded calico dress, high-collared and long-sleeved, meant for a white woman. It was too tight in the shoulders and loose in the waist, but it covered her. She had washed the war paint from her face. Her hair was braided and pinned up, hidden beneath a heavy woolen shawl. She looked uncomfortable, pulling at the collar, her movements restricted by the heavy fabric. She looked like a stranger. You look, Luke started, but couldn't find the word. I feel like a trapped bird, she said, her voice tight. This cloth, it scratches. It smells of soap and fear. It is armor. Luke said, just for a day. He had donned a cleaner shirt and a vest that hid the bandage on his shoulder. He strapped on his gun belt, low, tied down. He didn't look like a scout anymore. He looked like a drifter who had seen hard miles. They rode out under the cover of darkness, leaving Taza to organize the warriors for the strike on the wagons. They rode double on Roan to sell the illusion, leaving Ayanna's mare behind. The ride to town was agonizingly tense. Ayanna sat behind the saddle, her arms around Luke's waist. At first, her grip was loose, barely touching him. But as the terrain grew rougher, she was forced to hold on. Luke could feel the heat of her body against his back. He could feel the tension in her arms. They didn't speak. There was too much unsaid between them, too much blood and grief. But the physical contact, enforced by necessity, began to thaw the ice. They reached the outskirts of town just after sunset. The town was busy, the saloons filling up, the street lamps casting pools of yellow light on the dusty road. Luke pulled his hat low. "Keep your head down," he whispered. "You are shy. You are tired. Let me do the talking." They rode down the main street. Luke felt Ayanna stiffen against him as they passed a group of soldiers laughing on a porch. She buried her face in his coat, trembling. "Easy," he murmured, reaching back to cover her hand with his. "I have you." He felt her fingers curl into his palm. It was a desperate grip. In this world of square buildings and loud voices, he was her only anchor. They hitched the horse in an alley behind a livery stable. Luke helped her down. For a moment, his hands lingered on her waist. She looked up at him from under the shawl. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the distant lights. The anger was there, buried deep, but overlaid with fear and a strange, reluctant reliance. "We need to find the clerk," Luke said, stepping back. "A man named Silas usually uses a lawyer called Higgins. But Higgins has a clerk who drinks, a man named O'Malley." They found O'Malley in the back of a cantina on the edge of the Mexican Quarter. He was a small, rat-faced man nursing a cheap whiskey. Luke left Ayanna in the shadows near the door and approached the table. He sat down without asking. "O'Malley," Luke said. The clerk jumped, spilling his drink. "Who are you?" "A man with a question," Luke said, sliding a silver dollar onto the table. It was the last of his money, and a thirsty friend. He signaled the barkeep for a bottle. O'Malley eyed the silver, then the bottle. "What do you want?" "I hear Silas Morgan is buying up the basin," Luke said, pouring a drink. "I hear he has a meeting tomorrow to finalize the deal." O'Malley drank the whiskey in one gulp. "Big deal. Biggest in the territory. Morgan is going to own everything from here to the border." "And Captain Harlan?" Luke asked, pouring another. "Is he buying land too?" O'Malley laughed. "A wet, hacking sound. Harlan? He don't buy land. He buys retirement. $5,000 in gold, deposited in a bank in San Francisco. That's the rumor." "Proof?" Luke asked. O'Malley narrowed his eyes. "Why do you care?" "Because I have a stake in it." Luke lied. O'Malley hesitated. He looked at the bottle. "Higgins keeps the ledger." O'Malley whispered. "In the safe at the office. It lists the payouts. Morgan is sloppy. He thinks he owns the law, so he writes it all down. Consulting fees, he calls it." "Where is the office?" "2 doors down from the courthouse. Back door is flimsy." Luke stood up. "Enjoy the drink." "O'Malley." He walked back to Ayanna. "We have a target," he whispered. They moved through the back alleys, avoiding the main street. The town felt hostile, vibrating with the energy of the coming conflict. Ayanna moved like a shadow in her heavy dress, silent and lethal. They found the office. It was dark. Luke tried the back door. Locked. He looked at Ayanna. She reached into her hair and pulled out a long, thin pin. She knelt by the lock. "Apaches don't use keys," Luke whispered. "We learn quickly," she murmured. A moment later, the lock clicked. They slipped inside. The office smelled of ink and dust. Luke struck a match, shielding the flame with his hand. The safe was in the corner. It was locked, but it wasn't a bank vault. It was a simple strongbox. Luke looked around. He found a heavy iron poker by the stove. "Stand back," he said. He jammed the poker into the gap of the door and leaned on it with his good shoulder. He gritted his teeth against the pain in his wound. Metal shrieked. The door popped open. Luke rifled through the papers. Deeds, surveys, and there it was, a leather-bound ledger. He flipped it open. His finger traced the lines. July 12th, payment to CPT, H, $1,000. August 4th, payment to CPT, H, $2,000. And there were others. Payments to the mayor, payments to the judge. "We got him," Luke whispered. He shoved the ledger into his shirt. Suddenly, voices erupted outside. Heavy boots crunched on the gravel. "A patrol! They are checking the doors," Ayanna hissed. Luke grabbed her hand. "Out the window." They scrambled through the side window just as the doorknob rattled. They landed in a narrow alleyway, barely wide enough for 2 people, squeezed between the office and the neighboring dry goods store. They pressed themselves against the rough brick wall, deep in the shadows. The soldiers walked past the mouth of the alley, their lanterns swinging. The light slashed across Luke and Ayanna, missing them by inches. They froze. Luke pressed his body against hers to shield her, shielding the white of her dress with his dark vest. Ayanna turned her face into his chest, holding her breath. They stood there for what felt like an hour, though it was only minutes. The boots faded, but neither of them moved. The adrenaline was coursing through them, hot and sharp. The fear of capture, the thrill of the theft, and the crushing proximity ignited something that had been smoldering since the night in the ravine. Luke looked down. Ayanna looked up. Her shawl had slipped back. Her eyes were dark and luminous in the gloom. "I thought," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I thought they had us. They don't," Luke breathed. He could feel her heart beating against his ribs. He could feel the warmth of her breath on his neck, the barrier of the dress, the disguise, the war. It all vanished. There was only the heat of her skin and the desperate need to affirm that they were alive. Luke brought his hand up to cup her face. His thumb brushed her cheekbone. "Ayanna," he said, his voice rough. "I meant what I said. I am yours. If we die tomorrow, I die yours." Ayanna let out a shuddering breath. She reached up and cupped his jaw, her fingers tracing the stubble. "You are not a traitor," she whispered fiercely. "You are my heart. I choose you. Luke Carver, fully, despite the blood, despite the grief. I choose you." She pulled his head down. This kiss was not like the one in the storm. That had been a question. This was an answer. It was deep, slow, and devastatingly possessive. It tasted of salt and dust, and a love that had clawed its way up through rock to find the sun. Ayanna opened to him, pressing her body against his, trying to merge their broken pieces into something whole. Luke groaned low in his throat, his hand tangling in the hair at the nape of her neck. He kissed her like a drowning man finding air. He wanted to stay in this alley forever. He wanted to forget the ledger and the war. But footsteps clattered on the boardwalk above them. Reality crashed back in. They pulled apart, breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. "We have to go," Luke whispered, his voice unsteady. Ayanna nodded, her eyes shining. "Yes, but we are not finished." They slipped out of the alley and back to the horse. The ride back to the hills was different. The silence was no longer heavy. It was charged with a shared secret, a bond that had been sealed in the shadow of the enemy. They reached the camp well before dawn. Taza was waiting. Luke tossed the ledger to him. "It is all there," Luke said. "The bribes, the lies." Taza looked at the book, unable to read the words but understanding their power. "The meeting is at noon," Luke said. "I will walk in at 10 minutes past. That is when you strike the wagons. Taza, when they hear the smoke, they will look out the window, and I will be standing there with the book." Taza nodded. A grim smile touched his lips. "It is a good plan." "White man, brother," Luke corrected. Taza paused, then nodded once. Sharply, "Brother." The camp settled into the restless quiet of the pre-dawn hours. The warriors began to prepare their weapons for the raid. Luke walked away from the main fire, heading toward a small, hidden hollow in the rocks 100 yards upstream. It was a place of solitude, sheltered by ancient junipers. He sat down on the soft pine needles, the weight of the coming day pressing on him. Soft footsteps approached. Ayanna stepped into the hollow. She had removed the restrictive dress and was back in her buckskins, but she had left her hair loose. It fell around her shoulders like a dark waterfall. "You should sleep," Luke said softly. "I cannot sleep," she said. She sat down beside him. The stars were spread above them like a cold river of light, brilliant and indifferent. She looked at the sky. "Do you think there is a place for us?" she asked. "After tomorrow?" Luke took her hand. "There is a valley I saw once," he said, "up north, in the rim country. Too high for cattle, too cold for the soft settlers. It has water. It has game." He looked at her. "I want to build a house there. Ayanna, not a wickiup, not a white man's mansion. A cabin, with a porch where we can watch the sun go down. A home." she whispered, testing the word. A home, he confirmed. Where your people can come. Where we can have... He stopped. Children, she finished for him. She turned to face him, her eyes searching his. Mixed blood children, she said. The whites will call them half-breeds. The Apache will look at them with suspicion. Let them look, Luke said fiercely. We will raise them to be strong, stronger than both sides. Ayanna moved closer. The conversation faded. Words were not enough anymore. They were two people standing on the edge of a precipice, and the only thing keeping them from falling was the gravity between them. She reached out and began to unbutton his vest. Her hands were steady, deliberate. Luke caught her wrists. Ayanna, no shame, she whispered, repeating the words she had said in the storm. No doubt. She leaned in and kissed the hollow of his throat. I want this. Luke, I want to know you, before the guns speak. Luke let go of her wrists. He pulled her into his arms, lowering her back onto the bed of pine needles and blankets. The night air was cold, but the heat between them was a living thing. They moved with a slowness born of reverence. Luke traced the scars on her arms, the map of her survival. Ayanna traced the puckered bullet wound on his shoulder, the old lash marks on his back from his childhood, reading the history of his pain with her fingertips. When they finally came together, it was not a frantic grasping. It was a surrender. It was a shedding of the armor they had both worn for so long. Luke buried his face in her hair, whispering her name like a prayer. Ayanna held him with a strength that belied her slender frame, arching into him, claiming him as her husband in the eyes of the stars and the earth. It was fierce. Yes, it was the desperate passion of lovers who know the sun might bring death, but beneath the fire, there was a profound tenderness, a silent language of hands and lips that promised, I see you, I accept you, I am with you. In the aftermath, they lay tangled together under the buffalo robe, listening to the wind sighing in the junipers. Ayanna rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. You belong to me, Luke Carver, she whispered into the darkness. And you to me, Ayanna, he replied, kissing the top of her head. Whatever the law says, whatever the army says, we are married. They lay there until the sky began to turn gray in the east. The brief sanctuary of the night was ending. They dressed in silence. The intimacy of the night hung around them, a shield against the coming violence. They walked back to the horses. The warriors were mounted, ready to ride with Taza. Luke checked his revolver. He checked the ledger tucked securely in his belt. He swung up onto Roan. Ayanna mounted her mare. She had her bow across her back and a rifle in the scabbard. She would be leading a second group to position themselves in the hills above the town. A fail-safe if Taza's raid failed. They brought their horses close together one last time. Luke reached out and took her hand. Ride fast, he said. Keep your head down. You talk too much. Cowboy, she said, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. She squeezed his hand hard. Then let go. Come back to me, she whispered. I will, Luke promised. He turned Roan toward the town, toward the daylight and the white world that wanted him dead. Ayanna turned toward the hills. They rode away from each other, carrying the memory of the night in their blood, knowing that the next few hours would decide whether their love would have a place in this harsh land, or if it would be just another ghost story whispered in the wind. The sun hung directly overhead, a white-hot coin pressed into the blue sheet of the sky, baking the town of Verde until the air itself seemed to shimmer and warp. It was noon. The heat was a physical weight, heavy enough to silence the usual midday bustle of the street. Even the stray dogs sought the deep shade under the boardwalks, panting with their tongues lolling in the dust. Inside the courthouse, however, the air was thick with a different kind of pressure. The room was stifling. The windows were open, but they admitted only dust and the buzzing of fat, lazy flies. At the front of the room, gathered around a heavy oak table, sat the men who believed they owned the territory. Silas Morgan sat in the center, wearing a vest of crisp black brocade and a silk tie that seemed immune to the sweat beading on everyone else's brow. To his right sat Captain Harlan, his uniform buttoned to the chin, his posture rigid. Beside them were the town judge, a man named Miller with a face like a dried apple, and the local preacher, who was nervously wiping his spectacles. They were waiting for the final signatures on the removal order. The double doors at the back of the room swung open. They didn't bang. They creaked. A slow, mournful sound that drew every eye in the room. Luke Carver walked in. He was alone. He looked like something the desert had chewed up and spat out. His clothes were stiff with dust and dried sweat. His left arm was in a sling, bound tight against his chest, and a streak of dried blood marred the white bandage. He walked with a limp, his boots thudding heavily on the floorboards, but his eyes were clear and cold as mountain water. In his good hand, he carried a leather-bound ledger. A murmur rippled through the gallery where the ranchers and shopkeepers sat. "Traitor," someone whispered. "That is the scout," another muttered. "The one who turned." Captain Harlan stood up, feigning a look of polite surprise, though his eyes darted to the ledger in Luke's hand. "Carver," Harlan said, his voice tight, "you are a long way from your savages. If you have come to surrender, you can wait in the jail." Luke didn't stop until he reached the railing that separated the crowd from the leaders. He tossed the ledger onto the table. It landed with a heavy slap that echoed in the silence. "I am not here to surrender. Captain," Luke said, his voice steady, "I am here to stop a theft." Silas Morgan narrowed his eyes. He leaned forward, looking at the book, then at Luke. "You are disrupting legal proceedings." "Cowboy," Morgan growled. "Sheriff, remove this trash." "Wait," Judge Miller said. He looked at the ledger. He recognized it. He looked at Luke with a sudden, sharp interest. "What is this?" "It is the cost of doing business," Luke said. He looked at the crowd, raising his voice so every man in the back could hear. "You have been told that the Apache are raiding the lower valley. You have been told that the army needs to clear them out for your safety. You have been told that Silas Morgan is buying the land to bring the railroad and prosperity to this town." Luke pointed a shaking finger at the ledger. "That book says different. That book says Silas Morgan paid 3 men to burn the Turner Ranch last month and blame it on the tribe. That book says he paid Captain Harlan $2,000 in gold to file false reports to the Department of the Interior." The room erupted. Men jumped to their feet. Shouts of anger and disbelief bounced off the walls. "Liar," Morgan shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "This is treason. He is lying to protect his squaw." "Read the dates," Luke shouted back, his voice cutting through the noise. He looked at the judge. "Page 10, July 12th. Payment to County Clerk O'Malley for falsifying the survey maps, $500. Page 20. Witness fees for the men who swore they saw Taza raiding the herd, $20 a head." The judge reached out and opened the book. His hands were shaking. He ran his finger down the column of figures. He stopped. He looked up at O'Malley, who was shrinking into the corner of the room, his face the color of old milk. "Is this your handwriting, O'Malley?" the judge asked quietly. O'Malley tried to speak, but only a squeak came out. He nodded, terrified. The mood in the room shifted instantly. It turned from hostility to a dangerous, simmering confusion. These men were hard. They hated the Apache, yes, but they hated a cheat even more. And they hated a man who played them for fools most of all. Morgan stood up, his face turning a dark, mottled red. "This is ridiculous," he roared. "I'm a businessman. I am bringing civilization to this godforsaken dust bowl. And you listen to this deserter, this white Indian?" He pulled a pistol from his coat, not aiming it yet, but holding it like a gavel. "I will not be put on trial by a traitor," Morgan shouted. "Captain Harlan, arrest him! Shoot him! He is an enemy combatant!" Harlan hesitated. He looked at the crowd. He saw the doubt in their eyes. He saw the judge reading the ledger. He saw his own name written there in black ink. Outside the town, on a ridge overlooking the valley, Ayanna lay flat on her stomach, watching the courthouse through a spyglass Luke had stolen. Taza lay beside her. They saw the commotion through the windows. They saw Morgan stand up. "Now," Ayanna said. Taza raised a red blanket and dropped it 3 times. A mile to the east, A thin column of smoke began to rise, then another to the north, then a third to the west, simultaneously. A young warrior galloped past the telegraph poles leading out of town. He threw a rope with a heavy stone weight over the wires, tied it to his saddle horn, and spurred his horse. The wires snapped with a sound like a whip crack, singing as they coiled back toward the poles. Inside the courthouse, a man near the window shouted, "Smoke! Look at the hills!" The crowd rushed to the windows. They saw the distinct black columns rising against the blue sky. "They are signaling." Someone yelled, "The Apache! They are all around us!" Luke stood his ground. He looked at Morgan, who was staring out the window with a look of dawning horror. "You thought they were a ragged band of starving refugees," Luke said softly. "You were wrong. They are an army, and right now, they are cutting your telegraph lines. You can't call for help, Morgan, and you can't lie to Washington anymore." Luke turned to the judge. "They do not want a war. Judge, they want the High Valley, the one the treaty promised them 10 years ago, the one Morgan tried to steal with ink and bribes." Luke leaned on the table, his good hand gripping the edge. "Grant them the land. Enforce the boundary. If you do, the smoke clears. If you don't, if you let Morgan have his way, then Taza rides into town, and he won't be bringing a ledger." The judge looked at the smoke. He looked at the angry faces of the townspeople who were realizing they had been used to start a war that would burn their homes. He looked at Harlan, who was sweating profusely. He made a calculation. It was the calculation of a survivor. "Sit down, Mr. Morgan," the judge said, his voice snapping like a dry twig. Morgan turned on him. "You can't be serious." The judge stood up. "The court acknowledges the evidence presented, in light of irregularities in the land surveys. All claims filed by the Morgan Cattle Company in the Northern Basin are hereby suspended pending a federal investigation." The judge looked at Luke. "And the Army will cease all operations against the tribe, provided they remain north of the Sleeping Rock line. Is that understood?" "It is a compromise," Luke said, "but we accept." Morgan made a sound like a wounded bull. He looked at his empire crumbling. He looked at the railroad contracts that would vanish. He looked at Luke, the man who had burned it all down with a book. "I will see you in hell," Morgan screamed. He raised the pistol. He didn't aim. He just fired. The crack of the gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Luke felt a searing heat tear across his ribs. He staggered back, crashing into the railing. Panic erupted. Men dove under benches. Women screamed. Morgan cocked the hammer again, his eyes wild, but before he could fire a second shot, the town deputy, a young man who had been watching the proceedings with growing disgust, swung his rifle butt. It connected with Morgan's wrist with a sickening crunch. The pistol flew across the room. Morgan howled, clutching his broken arm. Two ranchers tackled him, pinning him to the floor. They were rough, their anger at being deceived finding a target in the man in the silk vest. Captain Harlan stood frozen. He saw the ship sinking. He saw the judge looking at him. I had no idea," Harlan stammered. "I was misled." "Arrest that man," he pointed at Morgan. The judge looked at Harlan with pure contempt. "You can explain that to the federal marshals." "Captain," the judge said, "until then, you are relieved of command." Luke pulled himself up. He pressed his hand to his side. His shirt was wet with blood, but the bullet had only grazed the ribs. It hurt like fire, but he could breathe. He looked down at Morgan, who was spitting curses from the floor. "It's over," Luke said. He turned and walked toward the doors. The crowd parted for him this time. They didn't cheer. They didn't pat him on the back. They stared at him with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. He was still the outsider. He was still the man who had chosen the other side. But he was the man who had told the truth. Luke pushed the doors open and stumbled out into the blinding sunlight. The street was empty. The dust was settling. He walked toward the alley where he had left the horse. His vision was swimming slightly. The heat, the blood loss, the adrenaline crash, it was all hitting him at once. He turned the corner into the shade of the alley. Ayanna was there. She had ridden down the moment she saw the commotion spill out onto the street. She was standing by Roan, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. She saw the blood on his shirt. "Luke!" She rushed to him. She didn't care who saw. She didn't care about the laws or the town. She threw her arms around him, her hands trembling as they touched his face, his chest, searching for the wound. "I'm all right," Luke gasped, leaning his weight against the wall. "Just a scratch. Morgan is a bad shot." Ayanna pulled his shirt up, checking the graze. Her fingers were gentle, cool against his burning skin. She let out a sob of relief, pressing her forehead against his shoulder. "He is arrested?" she asked, her voice muffled against his coat. "He is finished," Luke said. "The judge suspended the claims. The army is standing down." Ayanna pulled back. She looked into his eyes. She saw the exhaustion there, but she also saw the victory. "We did it," she whispered. "Survival," Luke said, echoing her father's words. "Bought at a price. But we kept the valley." In the dusty alley, amid the smell of gunpowder and horse manure, they clung to each other. It wasn't a romantic embrace of storybooks. It was the desperate clutching of two soldiers who had survived the war. Luke smoothed her hair, his hands shaking. Ayanna held him up, her strength becoming his. "Let's go home," she said. The weeks that followed were a time of healing, both for the flesh and for the land. The tribe moved north, past the Sleeping Rock, into the high valley that was now recognized, on paper at least, as theirs. It was not the vast territory they had once roamed. They were hemmed in by invisible lines, but it was defensible. It had water, and for the first time in years, they could light their fires at night without fear of the dawn bringing soldiers. Luke did not live in the camp. He chose a spot on the southern edge of the valley, where the pine forest gave way to the open range. It was a boundary place, a place between worlds. He built a cabin there. It was small, built of rough-hewn logs and chinked with mud. It had a stone chimney and a porch that looked out over the drop-off, toward the distant towns of the white men. He worked on it slowly, his shoulders stiff but healing. The Apache watched him. Some still spat when they rode past, their hatred of the white skin too deep to ever fade. But others stopped. They watched him sweat. They remembered the courthouse. They remembered the ledger. One evening, as Luke was struggling to lift a heavy ridgepole, a shadow fell over him. He looked up. Taza stood there. The warrior still walked with a limp from the bear trap, and his face was a map of new scars from the battle in the pass. Taza didn't speak. He stepped forward, grabbed the other end of the log, and heaved. Together. They lifted it into place. They stood back, breathing hard. Taza looked at the cabin. "It is a small wickiup." Taza grunted. "The wind will blow through these cracks." "I'll fill them with moss," Luke said, wiping his brow. Taza looked at Luke. He reached out and gripped Luke's shoulder. "The good one. You bleed like us," Taza said. "You fight like us." He paused, struggling with the word. "Brother." Taza said. "Brother," Luke replied. Taza nodded, then turned and walked away. It was not a hug. It was not a tearful declaration. But in the silence of the mountains, it was everything. Ayanna moved between the two worlds like a weaver passing a shuttle through a loom. She was the leader of her people now. She sat in the council. She organized the winter stores. She dealt with the army patrols that occasionally rode up to check the boundary lines, meeting them with a gaze so fierce that the soldiers looked at their boots. But every night, when the sun dipped below the peaks, she rode to the cabin. She was Luke's wife. There had been no priest, no ceremony with rings, but the tribe knew, and the mountains knew. One evening in late autumn, the air crisp and smelling of pine, they sat on the porch. A fire crackled inside the cabin, casting a warm glow through the open door. Luke sat in a rocking chair he had built, whittling a piece of cedar. Ayanna sat on the railing, her legs dangling, wearing one of Luke's old flannel shirts over her buckskin skirt. She was laughing softly. "Say it again," she said. "Shush," Luke said. struggling with the Apache word for bear. Shush! No, she giggled. You sound like a snake. It is deep in the throat. Shush! I'll stick to bear, Luke grumbled, smiling. My throat isn't built for your language. Ayana hopped down from the railing. She walked over to him and took the knife and wood from his hands. She placed them on the floor. She straddled his lap, wrapping her arms around his neck. She picked up his hat from the table and placed it on her own head. It slid down over her eyes. She pushed it back, grinning at him. You are a terrible Apache, she teased. And you make a terrible cowboy, he countered, adjusting the hat so he could see her eyes. Her smile faded slowly, replaced by a look of intense, quiet emotion. She traced the line of his jaw, the gray that was beginning to show in his beard. We made it, she whispered. The snow is coming, and we are here. Luke wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her close. We are here, he said. They looked out at the horizon. Far to the south, the lights of a new town were twinkling in the distance. The railroad was coming. More settlers were coming. The world was changing, shrinking, closing in around them. They knew the peace was fragile. They knew that one day the paper might burn again, and the guns might return. They spoke sometimes, in low voices, about the children they might have. Children who would walk in two worlds, who would face a prejudice neither of them could fully shield them from. But as the sky blazed into a brilliant, defiant orange over the jagged hills, Luke felt a peace he had never known in all his years of wandering. He looked at the woman in his arms, the woman who had once looked at him with hatred, who had saved him in a storm, who had stood beside him in the fire. He took her hand, interlacing their fingers. Her skin was dark against his, scarred and strong. The future was a dark road, unmapped and dangerous, but they would walk it together. Ayana leaned her head on his shoulder. Luke rested his chin on the brim of the hat she wore. In the silence of the high valley, standing at the doorway of their home, the white cowboy and the Apache woman watched the night come on. They did not light a lamp. They did not need to. Their love, born of tragedy, guilt, courage, and fierce desire, was light enough. It burned quietly, defiantly, against the darkness, refusing to be extinguished. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Luke and Ayana through the rugged landscapes of the American Southwest. It has been a pleasure to bring this tale of love, survival, and history to life for you. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below and share your location. If you enjoyed this story, I encourage you to subscribe to From Wild West so you never miss a new adventure. Please share your thoughts on the story in English in the comments section. Did Luke make the right choice? What do you think the future holds for them? I look forward to reading your insights. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.